Chapter 20 of Historical Tales, Volume 5, German. Historical Tales, Volume 5, German, by Charles Morris. Chapter 20 Ziska the Blind Warrior. Sigismund, Emperor of Germany, had sworn to put an end to the Hussite rebellion in Bohemia, and to punish the rebels in a way that would make all future rebels tremble. But Sigismund was pursuing the old policy of cooking the hare before it was caught. He forgot that the indomitable John Ziska and the iron-flailed peasantry stood between him and his vow. He had first to conquer the reformers before he could punish them, and this was to prove no easy task. The dreadful work of religious war began with the burning of Hussite preachers who had ventured from Bohemia into Germany. This was an argument which Ziska thoroughly understood, and he retorted by destroying the Bohemian monasteries and burning the priests alive in barrels of pitch. "They are singing my sister's wedding song," exclaimed the grim barbarian, on hearing their cries of torture. Queen Sophia, widow of Wenceslas, the late king, who had garrisoned all the castles, now sent a strong body of troops against the reformers. The army came up with the multitude, which was largely made up of women and children, on the open plain near Pilsen. The cavalry charged upon the seemingly helpless mob, but Ziska was equal to the occasion. He ordered the women to strew the ground with their gowns and veils, and the horses' feet becoming entangled in these, numbers of the riders were thrown, and the trim lines of the troops broken. Seeing the confusion into which they had been thrown, Ziska gave the order to charge, and in a short time the army that was to defeat him was flying in a panic across the plain, a broken and beaten mob. Another army marched against him and was similarly defeated, and the citizens of Prague, finding that no satisfactory terms could be made with the emperor, recalled Ziska and entered into alliance with him. The one-eyed patriot was now lord of the land, all Bohemia being at his beck and call. Meanwhile Sigismund, the emperor, was slowly gathering his forces to invade the rebellious land. The reign of cruelty continued, each side treating its prisoners barbarously. The imperialists branded theirs with a cup, the Hussites theirs with a cross, on their foreheads. The citizens of Breslau joined those of Prague, and emulated them by flinging their councillors out of the town-house windows. In return, the German miners of Kuttenberg threw 1,600 Hussites down the mines. Such is religious war, the very climax of cruelty. In June 1420 the threatened invasion came. Sigismund led an army 100,000 strong into the revolted land, fulminating vengeance as he marched. He reached Prague and entered the castle of Vyšehrad, which commanded it. Ziska fortified the mountain of Whitlow, now called Ziskaberg, which also commanded the city. Sigismund, finding that he had been outgeneraled and that his opponent held the controlling position, waited and temporized, amusing himself meanwhile by assuming the crown of Bohemia, and sowing dissension in his army by paying the Slavonian and Hungarian troops with the jewels taken from the royal palaces and the churches, while leaving the Germans unpaid. The Germans, furious, marched away. The emperor was obliged to follow. The ostentatious invasion was at an end, and scarcely a blow had been struck. But Sigismund had no sooner gone than trouble arose in Prague. The citizens, the nobility, and Ziska's followers were all at odds. The Taborites, those strict republicans and religious reformers who had made Mount Tabor their headquarters, were in power, and ruled the city with a rod of iron, destroying all the remaining splendor of the churches, and sternly prohibiting every display of ostentation by the people. Death was named as the punishment for such venial faults as dancing, gambling, or the wearing of rich attire. The wine cellars were rigidly closed. Church property was declared public property, and it looked as if private wealth would soon be similarly viewed. The peasants declared that it was their mission to exterminate sin from the earth. This tyranny so incensed the nobles and citizens that they rose in self-defence, and Ziska, finding that Prague had grown too hot to hold him, deemed it prudent to lead his men away. Sigismund took immediate advantage of the opportunity by marching on Prague, but quick as he was, there were others quicker. The more moderate section of the reformers, the so-called Horebites, from Mount Horeb, another place of assemblage, entered the city, led by Husinus, Huss's former lord, and laid siege to the royal fortress, the Vyšehrad. Sigismund attempted to surprise them, but met with so severe a repulse that he fled into Hungary, and the Vyšehrad was forced to capitulate, this ancient palace and its church, both splendid works of art, being destroyed. Step by step the art and splendour of Bohemia were vanishing in this despotic struggle between heresy and the papacy. As the war went on, Ziska, its controlling spirit, grew steadily more abhorrent of privilege and distinction, more bitterly fanatical. The ancient church, royalty, nobility, all excited his wrath. He was republican, socialist, almost anarchist in his views. His idea of perfection lay in a fraternity composed of the children of God, while he trusted to the strokes of the iron flail to bear down all opposition to his theory of society. The city of Prachatice treated him with mockery and was burnt to the ground with all its inhabitants. The Bishop of Nicopolis fell into his hands and was flung into the river. As time went on, his war of extermination against sinners, that is, all who refused to join his banner, grew more cruel and unrelenting. Each city that resisted was stormed and ruined, its inhabitants slaughtered, its priests burned. Hussite virtue had degenerated into tyranny of the worst type. Yet while thus fanatical himself, Ziska would not permit his followers to indulge in insane excesses of religious zeal. A party arose which claimed that the millennium was at hand, and that it was their duty to anticipate the coming of the innocents of paradise by going naked like Adam and Eve. These Adamites committed the maddest excesses, but found a stern enemy in Ziska, who put them down with an unsparing hand. In 1421 Sigismund again roused himself to activity, incensed by the Hussite defiance of his authority. He incited the Silesians to invade Bohemia, and an army of 20,000 poured into the land, killing all before them, men, women, and children. Yet such was the terror that the very name of Ziska now excited, that the mere rumour of his approach sent these invaders flying across the borders. But in the midst of his career of triumph an accident came to the Bohemian leader which would have incapacitated any less resolute man from military activity. During the siege of the castle of Rabi, a splinter struck his one useful eye and completely deprived him of sight. It did not deprive him of power and energy. Most men, under such circumstances, would have retired from army leadership, but John Ziska was not of that calibre. He knew Bohemia so thoroughly that the whole land lay accurately mapped out in his mind. He continued to lead his army, to marshal his men in battle array, to command them in the field and the siege, despite his blindness, always riding in a carriage close to the great standard, and keeping in immediate touch with all the movements of the war. Blind as he was, he increased rather than diminished the severity of his discipline, and insisted on rigid obedience to his commands. As an instance of this we are told that on one occasion, having compelled his troops to march day and night as was his custom, they murmured and said, "Day and night are the same to you, as you cannot see, but they are not the same to us." "How?" he cried, "you cannot see? Well, set fire to a couple of villages." The blind warrior was soon to have others to deal with than his Bohemian foes. Sigismund had sent forward another army, which in September 1421 invaded the country. It was driven out by the mere rumour of Ziska's approach, the soldiers flying in haste on the vague report of his coming. But in November the Emperor himself came, leading a horde of 80,000 Hungarians, Servians, and others, savage fellows, whose approach filled the moderate party of the Bohemians with terror. Ziska's men had such confidence in their blind chief as to be beyond terror. They were surrounded by the enemy and enclosed in what seemed a trap, but under Ziska's orders they made a night attack on the foe, broke through their lines, and to the Emperor's discomfiture were once more free. On New Year's Day, 1422, the two armies came face to face near Zolin. Ziska drew up his men in battle array, and confidently awaited the attack of the enemy. But the inflexible attitude of his men, the terror of his name, or one of those inexplicable influences which sometimes affects armies, filled the Hungarians with a sudden panic, and they vanished from the front of the Bohemians without a blow. Once more the Emperor and the army which he had led into the country with such high confidence of success were in shameful flight, and the terrible example which he had vowed to make of Bohemia was still unaccomplished. The blind chief vigorously and relentlessly pursued, overtaking the fugitives on January 8th near Deutschbrod. Terrified at his approach, they sought to escape by crossing the stream at that place on the ice. The ice gave way, and numbers of them were drowned. Deutschbrod was burned, and its inhabitants slaughtered in Ziska's cruel fashion. This repulse put an end to invasions of Bohemia while Ziska lived. There were intestine disturbances which needed to be quelled, and then the army of the reformers was led beyond the boundaries of the country and assailed the imperial dominions, but the Emperor held aloof. He had had enough of the blind terror of Bohemia, the indomitable Ziska and his iron-flailed peasants. New outbreaks disturbed Bohemia. Ambitious nobles aspired to the kingship, but their efforts were vain. The army of the iron flail quickly put an end to all such hopes. In 1423 Ziska invaded Moravia and Austria to keep his troops employed, and lost severely in doing so. In 1424 his enemies at home again made head against him, led an army into the field, and pursued him to Kuttenberg. There he ordered his men to feign a retreat, then, while the foe were triumphantly advancing, he suddenly turned, had his battle chariot driven furiously down the mountain side upon their lines, and during the confusion thus caused, ordered an attack in force. The enemy were repulsed, their artillery were captured, and Kuttenberg set in flames as Ziska's signal of triumph. Shortly afterwards, his enemies at home being thoroughly beaten, the indomitable blind chief marched upon Prague, the headquarters of his foes, and threatened to burn this city to the ground. He might have done so, too, but for his own men, who broke into sedition at the threat. Prokop, Ziska's bravest captain, advised peace to put an end to the disasters of civil war. His advice was everywhere re-echoed, the demand for peace seemed unanimous, Ziska alone opposing it. Mounting a cask and facing his discontented followers, he exclaimed, "Fear internal more than external foes. It is easier for a few when united to conquer than for many when disunited. Snares are laid for you, you will be entrapped, but it will not be my fault." Despite his harangue, however, peace was concluded between the contending factions, and a large monument raised in commemoration thereof, both parties heaping up stones. Ziska entered the city in solemn procession, and was met with respect and admiration by the citizens. Prince Korybut, the leader of the opposite party and the aspirant to the crown, came to meet him, embraced him, and called him father. The triumph of the blind chief over his internal foes was complete. It seemed equally complete over his external foes. Sigismund, unable to conquer him by force of arms, now sought to mollify him by offers of peace, and entered into negotiations with the stern old warrior. But Ziska was not to be placated. He could not trust the man who had broken his plighted word and burned John Huss, and he remained immovable in his hostility to Germany. Planning a fresh attack on Moravia, he began his march thither, but now he met a conquering enemy against whose arms there was no defence. Death encountered him on the route, and carried him off on October 12th, 1424. Thus ends the story of an extraordinary man, and the history of a series of remarkable events. Of all the peasant outbreaks, of which there were so many during the medieval period, the Bohemian was the only one, if we except the Swiss struggle for liberty, that attained measurable success. This was due in part to the fact that it was a religious instead of an industrial revolt, and thus did not divide the country into sharp ranks of rich and poor, and in greater part to the fact that it had an able leader, one of those men of genius who seem born for great occasions. John Ziska, the blind warrior, leading his army to victory after victory, stands alone in the gallery of history. There were none like him before or after. He is pictured as a short, broad-shouldered man with a large, round, and bald head. His forehead was deeply furrowed, and he wore a long moustache of a fiery red hue. This, with his blind eye and his final complete blindness, yields a well-defined image of the man, that fanatical, remorseless, indomitable, and unconquerable avenger of the martyred Huss, the first successful opponent of the doctrines of the Church of Rome whom history records. The conclusion of the story of the Hussites may be briefly given. For years they held their own under two leaders, known as Prokop Holy and Prokop the Little, defying the emperor and at times invading the empire. The Pope preached a crusade against them, but the army of invasion was defeated, and Silesia and Austria were invaded in reprisal by Prokop Holy. 7 years after the death of Ziska, an army of invasion again entered Bohemia, so strong in numbers that it seemed as if that war-drenched land must fall before it. In its ranks were 130,000 men, led by Frederick of Brandenburg. Their purposes were seen in their actions. Every village reached was burned, till 200 had been given to the flames. Horrible excesses were committed. On August 14th, 1431, the two armies, the Hussite and the Imperialist, came face to face near Taus. The disproportion in numbers was enormous, and it looked as if the small force of Bohemians would be swallowed up in the multitude of their foes. But barely was the Hussite banner seen in the distance, when the old story was told over again, The Germans broke into sudden panic and fled en masse from the field. The Bavarians were the first to fly, and all the rest speedily followed. Frederick of Brandenburg and his troops took refuge in a wood. The Cardinal Julian, who had preached a crusade against Bohemia, succeeded for a time in rallying the fugitives, but at the first onset of the Hussites they again took to flight, suffering themselves to be slaughtered without resistance. The munitions of war were abandoned to the foe, including 150 cannon. It was an extraordinary affair, but in truth the flight was less due to terror than to disinclination of the German soldiers to fight the Hussites, whose cause they deemed to be just and glorious, and the influence of whose opinions had spread far beyond the Bohemian border. Rome was losing its hold over the mind of northern Europe outside the limits of the land of Huss and Ziska. Negotiations for peace followed. The Bohemians were invited to Basel, being granted a safe conduct, and promised free exercise of their religion, coming and going, while no words of ridicule or reproach were to be permitted. On January 9th, 1433, 300 Bohemians, mounted on horseback, entered Basel, accompanied by an immense multitude. It was a very different entrance from that of Huss to Constance, nearly 20 years before, and was to have a very different termination. Procop Holy headed the procession, accompanied by others of the Bohemian leaders. A signal triumph had come to the party of religious reform after 20 years of struggle. For 50 days the negotiations continued, neither side would yield. In the end the Bohemians, weary of the protracted and fruitless debate, took to their horses again and set out homewards. This brought their enemies to terms. An embassy was hastily sent after them, and all their demands were conceded, though with certain reservations that might prove perilous in the future. They went home triumphant, having won freedom of religious worship according to their ideas of right and truth. They had not long reached home when dissensions again broke out. The Emperor took advantage of them, accepted the crown of Bohemia, entered Prague, and at once reinstated the Catholic religion. The fanatics flew to arms, but after a desperate struggle were annihilated. The Bohemian struggle was at an end. In the following year the Emperor Sigismund died, having lived just long enough to win success in his long conflict. The martyrdom of Huss, the valour and zeal of Ziska, appeared to have been in vain. Yet they were not so, for the seeds they had sown bore fruit in the following century in a great sectarian revolt, which affected all Christendom and permanently divided the Church. End of chapter 20. Chapter 21 of Historical Tales, Volume 5, German. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Historical Tales, Volume 5, German, by Charles Morris. Chapter 21. The Siege of Belgrade. The Empire of Rome finally reached its end, not in the 5th century, as ordinarily considered, but in the 15th. Not at Rome, but at Constantinople, where the Eastern Empire survived the Western for 1,000 years. At length, in 1453, the Turks captured Constantinople, set a broad foot upon the degenerate Empire of the East, and crushed out the last feeble remnants of life left in the pygmy successor of the Colossus of the past. And now Europe, which had looked on with clasped hands while the Turks swept over the Bosphorus and captured Constantinople, suddenly awoke to the peril of its situation. A blow, in time, might have saved the Greek Empire. The blow had not been struck, and now Europe had itself to save. Terror seized upon the nations which had let their petty intrigues stand in the way of that broad policy in which safety lay, for they could not forget past instances of Asiatic invasion. The frightful ravages wrought by the Huns and the Avars were far in the past, but no long time had elapsed since the coming of the Magyars and the Mongols, and now here was another of those hordes of murderous barbarians, hanging like a cloud of war on the eastern skirt of Europe, and threatening to rain death and ruin upon the land. The dread of the nations was not amiss. They had neglected to strengthen the eastern barrier to the Turkish avalanche. Now it threatened their very doors, and they must meet it at home. The Turks were not long in making their purpose evident. Within 2 years after the fall of Constantinople they were on the march again, and had laid siege to Belgrade, the first obstacle in their pathway to universal conquest. The Turkish cannons were thundering at the doors of Europe. Belgrade fallen, Vienna would come next, and the march of the barbarians might only end at the sea. And yet, despite their danger, the people of Germany remained supine. Hungary had valiantly defended itself against the Turks 10 years before, without aid from the German Empire. It looked now as if Belgrade might be left to its fate. The brave John Hunyadis and his faithful Hungarians were the only bulwarks of Europe against the foe, for the people seemed incapable of seeing a danger 1,000 miles away. The Pope and his legate John Capistrano, general of the Capuchins, were the only aids to the valiant Hunyadis in his vigorous defence. They preached a crusade, but with little success. Capistrano traversed Germany, eloquently calling the people to arms against the barbarians. The result was similar to that on previous occasions. The real offenders were neglected, the innocent suffered. The people, instead of arming against the Turks, turned against the Jews, and murdered them by thousands. Whatever happened in Europe, a plague, an invasion, a famine, a financial strait, that unhappy people were in some way held responsible, and medieval Europe seemed to think it could at any time check the frightful career of a comet or ward off pestilence by slaughtering a few thousands of Jews. It cannot be said that it worked well on this occasion. The Jews died, but the Turks surrounded Belgrade still. Capistrano found no military ardour in Germany, in princes or people. The princes contented themselves with ordering prayers and ringing the Turkish bells, as they were called. The people were as supine as their princes. He did, however, succeed, by the aid of his earnest eloquence, in gathering a force of a few thousands of peasants, priests, and scholars, and the like, a motley host, who were chiefly armed with iron flails and pitchforks, but who followed him with an enthusiasm equal to his own. With this shadow of an army he joined Hunyadis, and the combined force made its way in boats down the Danube into the heart of Hungary, and approached the frontier fortress which Mahomet II. Was besieging with a host of 160,000 men, and which its defender, the brother-in-law of John Hunyadis, had nearly given up for lost. On came the flotilla, the peasants with their flails and forks, and Hunyadis with his trained soldiers, and attacked the Turkish fleet with such furious energy that it was defeated and dispersed, and the allied forces made their way into the beleaguered city. Capistrano and his followers were full of enthusiasm. He was a second Peter the Hermit. His peasant horde were crusaders, fierce against the infidels, disdaining death in God's cause. Neither leader nor followers had a grain of military knowledge or experience, but they had what is sometimes better, courage and enthusiasm. John Hunyadis had military experience, and looked with cold disfavour on the burning and blind zeal of his new recruits. He was willing that they should aid him in repelling the furious attacks of the Turks, but to his trained eyes an attack on the well-entrenched camp of the enemy would have been simple madness, and he sternly forbade any such suicidal course, even threatening death to whoever should attempt it. In truth, his caution seemed reasonable. An immense host surrounded the city on the land side, and had done so on the water side also, until the Christian flotilla had sunk, captured, and dispersed its boats. Far as the eye could see, the gorgeously embellished tents of the Turkish army, with their gilded crescents glittering in the sun, filled the field of view. Cannon-mounted earthworks threatened the walls from every quarter. Squadrons of steel-clad horsemen swept the field. The crowding thousands of besiegers pressed the city day and night. Even defence seemed useless. Assault on such a host appeared madness to experienced eyes. Hunyadis seemed wise in his stern disapproval of such an idea. Yet military knowledge has its limitations, when it fails to take into account the power of enthusiasm. Blind zeal is a force whose possibilities a general does not always estimate. It is capable of performing miracles, as Hunyadis was to learn. His orders, his threats of death, had no restraining effect on the minds of the Crusaders. They had come to save Europe from the Turks, and they were not to be stayed by orders or threats. What, though the enemy greatly outnumbered them, and had cannons and scimitars against their pikes and flails, had they not God on their side? And should God's army pause to consider numbers and cannon balls? They were not to be restrained. Attack they would, and attack they did. The siege had made great progress. The reinforcement had come barely in time. The walls were crumbling under the incessant bombardment. Convinced that he had made a practicable breach, Mahomet the Sultan ordered an assault in force. The Turks advanced full of barbarian courage, climbed the crumbled walls, and broke, as they supposed, into the town, only to find new walls frowning before them. The vigorous garrison had built new defences behind the old ones, and the disheartened assailants learned that they had done their work in vain. This repulse greatly discouraged the Sultan. He was still more discouraged when the Crusaders, irrepressible in their hot enthusiasm, broke from the city and made a fierce attack upon his works. Capistrano, seeing that they were not to be restrained, put himself at their head, and with a stick in one hand and a crucifix in the other, led them to the assault. it proved an irresistible one. The Turks could not sustain themselves against these flail-swinging peasants. One entrenchment after another fell into their hands, until 3 had been stormed and taken. Their success inspired Hunyadis. Filled with a new respect for his peasant allies, and seeing that now or never was the time to strike, he came to their aid with his cavalry, and fell so suddenly and violently upon the Turkish rear that the invaders were put to rout. Onward pushed the Crusaders and their allies, backward went the Turks. The remaining entrenchments were stubbornly defended, but that storm of iron flails, those pikes and pitchforks wielded by the zeal of enthusiasts, were not to be resisted, and in the end all that remained of the Turkish army broke into panic flight, the Sultan himself being wounded, and more than 20,000 of his men left dead upon the field. It was a signal victory, miraculous almost when one considers the great disproportion of the numbers. The works of the invaders, mounted with 300 cannon, and their camp, which contained an immense booty, fell into the hands of the Christians, and the power of Mohammed II was so crippled that years passed before he was in condition to attempt a second invasion of Europe. The victors were not long to survive their signal triumph. The valiant Hunyadis died shortly after the battle from wounds received in the action or from fatal disease. Capistrano died in the same year, 1456. Hunyadis left 2 sons, and the King of Hungary repaid his services by oppressing both and beheading one of these sons. But the king himself died during the next year, and Matthias Corvinus, the remaining son of Hunyadis, was placed by the Hungarians on their throne. They had given their brave defender the only reward in their power. If the victory of Hunyadis and Capistrano, the nobleman and the monk, had been followed up by the princes of Europe, the Turks might have been driven from Constantinople, Europe saved from future peril at their hands, and the tide of subsequent history gained a cleaner and purer flow. But nothing was done, and the princes were too deeply interested in their petty squabbles to entertain large views, and the Turks were suffered to hold the empire of the East, and quietly to recruit their forces for later assaults. End of Chapter 21. Chapter 22 of Historical Tales, Volume 5, German. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Historical Tales, Volume 5, German, by Charles Morris. Chapter 22. Luther and the Indulgences. Late in the month of April, in the year 1521, an open wagon, containing 2 persons, was driven along one of the roads of Germany, the horse being kept at his best pace, while now and then one of the occupants looked back as if in apprehension. This was the man who held the reins. The other, a short but presentable person, with pale, drawn face, lit by keen eyes, seemed too deeply buried in thought to be heedful of surrounding affairs. When he did lift his eyes, they were directed ahead, where the road was seen to enter the great Thuringian forest. Dressed in clerical garb, the peasants who passed probably regarded him as a monk on some errand of mercy. The truth was that he was a fugitive, fleeing for his life, for he was a man condemned, who might at any moment be waylaid and seized. On entering the forest, the wagon was driven on until a shaded and lonely dell was reached, seemingly a fitting place for deeds of violence. Suddenly, from the forest glades, rode forth 4 armed and masked men, who stopped the wagon, sternly bade the traveller to descend, and mount a spare horse they had with them, and rode off with him, a seeming captive, through the thick woodland. As if in fear of pursuit, the captors kept at a brisk pace, not drawing rein until the walls of a large and strong castle loomed up near the forest border. The gates flew open, and the drawbridge fell at their demand, and the small cavalcade rode into the powerful stronghold, the entrance to which was immediately closed behind them. It was the castle of Wartburg, near Eisenach, Saxony, within whose strong walls the man thus mysteriously carried off was to remain hidden from the world for the greater part of the year that followed. The monk-like captive was, just then, the most talked-of man in Germany. His seemingly violent capture had been made by his friends, not by his foes, its purpose being to protect him from his enemies, who were many and threatening. Of this he was well aware, and welcomed the castle as a place of refuge. He was, in fact, the celebrated Martin Luther, who had just set in train a religious revolution of broad aspect in Germany, and though for the time under the protection of a safe conduct from the Emperor Charles V., had been deemed in imminent danger of falling into an ambush of his foes instead of one of his friends. That he might not be recognized by those who should see him at Wartburg, his ecclesiastic robe was exchanged for the dress of a knight. He wore helmet and sword instead of cassock and cross, and let his beard grow freely. Thus changed in appearance, he was known as Junker George (Chevalier George) to those in the castle, and amused himself at times by hunting with his knightly companions in the neighbourhood. The greater part of his time, however, was occupied in a difficult literary task, that of translating the Bible into German. The work thus done by him was destined to prove as important in a linguistic as in a theological sense, since it fixed the status of the German language for the later period to the same extent as the English translation of the Bible in the time of James I aided to fix that of the English speech. Leaving Luther for the present time in his retreat at Wartburg Castle, we must go back in his history and tell the occasion of the events just narrated. No man before or after his time ever created so great a disturbance in German thought, and the career of this fugitive monk is one of great historical import. A peasant by birth, the son of a slate cutter named Hans Luther, he so distinguished himself as a scholar that his father proposed to make him a lawyer. But a dangerous illness, the death of a near friend, and the exhortations of an eloquent preacher so wrought upon his mind, that he resolved instead to become a monk, and after going through the necessary course of study and mental discipline, was ordained a priest in May 1507. The next year he was appointed a professor in the University of Wittenberg. There he remained for the next 10 years of his life, when an event occurred which was to turn the whole current of his career, and give him a prominence in theological history which few other men have ever attained. In 1517 Pope Leo X authorized an unusually large issue of indulgences, a term which signifies a remission of the temporal punishment due to sin, either in this life or the life to come, the condition being that the recipient shall have made a full confession of his sins, and by his penitence and purpose of amendment fitted himself to receive the pardon of God through the agency of the priest. He was also required to perform some service in the aid of charity or religion, such as the giving of alms. At the time of the Crusades the popes had granted to all who took part in them remission from church penalties. At a later date the same indulgence was granted to penitents who aided the holy wars with money instead of in person. At a still later date remission from the penalties of sin might be obtained by pious work, such as building churches, etc. When the Turks threatened Europe, those who fought against them obtained indulgence. In the instance of the issue of indulgences by Leo X, the pious work required was the giving of alms in aid of the completion of the great cathedral of St. Peter's at Rome. The purpose did not differ in character from others for which indulgences had previously been granted, and there is nothing to show that any disregard of the requisite conditions was authorized by the Pope. But there is reason to believe that some of the agents for the disposal of these indulgences went much beyond the intention of the decree. This was especially the case in the instance of a Dominican monk named Tetzel, who is charged with openly asserting what few or no other Catholics appear to have ever claimed, that the indulgences not only released the purchasers from the necessity of penance, but absolved them from all consequences of sin in this world or the next. We shall not go into the details of the venalities charged against Tetzel, whose field of labour was in Saxony, but they seem to have been sufficient to cause a strong feeling of dissatisfaction, which at length found a voice in Martin Luther, who preached vigorously against Tetzel and his methods, and wrote to the princes and bishops begging them to refuse this irreligious dealer in indulgences a passage through their dominion. The near approach of Tetzel to Wittenberg roused Luther to more decided action. He now wrote out 95 propositions, in which he set forth in the strongest language his reasons for opposing and his view of the pernicious effects of Tetzel's doctrine of indulgences. These he nailed to the door of the castle church of Wittenberg. The effect produced by them was extraordinary. The news of the protest spread with the greatest rapidity, and within a fortnight copies of it had been distributed throughout Germany. Within 5 or 6 weeks it was being read over a great part of Europe. On all sides it aroused a deep public interest and excitement, and became the great sensation of the day. We cannot go into the details of what followed. Luther's propositions were like a thunderbolt flung into the mind of Germany. Everywhere deep thought was aroused, and a host of those who had been displeased with Tetzel's methods sustained him in his act. Other papers from his pen followed, in which his revolt from the Church of Rome grew wider and deeper. His energetic assault aroused a number of opponents, and an active controversy ensued, ending in Luther's being cited to appear before Cajetan, the Pope's legate at Augsburg. From this meeting no definite result came. After a heated argument, Cajetan ended the controversy with the following words: "I can dispute no longer with this beast. It has two wicked eyes and marvellous thoughts in its head." Luther's view of the matter was much less complimentary. He said of the legate, "He knows no more about the Word than a donkey knows of harp playing." In the next year, 1519, a discussion took place at Leipzig between Luther on the one hand, aided by his friends Melanchthon and Karlstadt, and a zealous and talented ecclesiastic, Dr. Eck, on the other. Eck was a vigorous debater, in person, in voice, and in opinion; but as Luther was not to be silenced by his argument, he ended by calling him a Gentile and a publican, and wending his way to Borne, where he expressed his opinion of the new movement, and demanded that the heretics should be made to feel the heavy hand of church discipline. Back he came soon to Germany, bearing a bull from the Pope, in which were extracts from Luther's writings stated to be heretical, and which must be publicly retracted within 60 days, under threat of excommunication. This the ardent agent tried to distribute throughout Germany, but to his surprise he found that Germany was in no humour to receive it. Most of the magistrates forbade it to be made public. Where it was posted upon the walls of any town, the people immediately tore it down. In truth, Luther's heresy had with extraordinary rapidity become the heresy of Germany, and he found himself with a nation at his back, a nation that admired his courage and supported his opinions. His most decisive step was taken on the 10th of December, 1520. On that day the faculty and students of the University of Wittenberg, convoked by him, met at the Elster gate of the town. Here a funeral pile was built up by the students, one of the magistrates set fire to it, and Luther, amid approving shouts from the multitude, flung into the flames the Pope's bull, and with it the canonical law and the writings of Dr. Eck. In this act he decisively broke loose from and defied the Church of Rome, sustained in his radical step of revolt apparently by all Wittenberg, and by a large body of converts to his views throughout Germany. The bold reformer found friends not only among the lowly, but among the powerful. The Elector of Saxony was on his side, and openly accused the Pope of acting the unjust judge by listening to one side and not the other, and of needlessly agitating the people by his bull. Ulrich von Hutten, a favourite popular leader, was one of the zealous proselytes of the new doctrines. Franz von Sichingen, a knight of celebrity, was another who offered Luther shelter, if necessary, in his castles. And now came a turning point in Luther's career, the most dangerous crisis he was to reach, and the one that needed the utmost courage and most inflexible resolution to pass it in safety. It was that which has become famous as the Diet of Worms. Germany had gained a new emperor, Charles V., under whose sceptre the empire of Charlemagne was in great part restored, for his dominions included Germany, Spain, and the Netherlands. This young monarch left Spain for Germany in 1521, and was no sooner there than he called a great diet to meet at Worms, that the affairs of the empire might be regulated, and that in particular this religious controversy, which was troubling the public mind, should be settled. Thither came the princes and potentates of the realm, thither great dignitaries of the Church, among them the Pope's legate, Cardinal Alexander, who was commissioned to demand that the emperor and the princes should call Luther to a strict account, and employ against him the temporal power. But to the cardinal's astonishment he found that the people of Germany had largely seceded from the papal authority. Everywhere he met with writings, songs, and pictures in which the Holy Father was treated with contempt and mockery. Even himself as the Pope's representative was greeted with derision, and his life at times was endangered, despite the fact that he came in the suite of the emperor. The Diet assembled, the cardinal, as instructed, demanded that severe measures should be taken against the arch-heretic. The Elector of Saxony, on the contrary, insisted that Luther should be heard in his own defence. The emperor and the princes agreed with him, silencing the cardinal's declaration that the Diet had no right or power to question the decision of the Pope, and inviting Luther to appear before the imperial assembly at Worms, the emperor granting him a safe conduct. Possibly Charles thought that the insignificant monk would fear to come before that august body, and the matter thus die out. Luther's friends strongly advised him not to go. They had the experience of John Huss to offer as argument. But Luther was not the man to be stopped by dread of dignitaries or fear of penalties. He immediately set out from Wittenberg for Worms, saying to his protesting friends, "Though there were as many devils in the city as there are tiles on the roofs, still I would go." His journey was an ovation. The people flocked by thousands to greet and applaud him. On his arrival at Worms 2,000 people gathered and accompanied him to his lodgings. When, on the next day, April 18th, 1521, the Grand Marshal of the Empire conducted him to the Diet, he was obliged to lead him across gardens and through byways, to avoid the throng that filled the streets of the town. When entering the hall, he was clapped on the shoulder by a famous knight and general of the Empire, Georg von Frundsberg, who said, "Monk, monk, thou art in a strait the like of which myself and many leaders, in the most desperate battles, have never known, but if thy thoughts are just, and thou art sure of thy cause, go on, in God's name, and be of good cheer, he will not forsake thee." Luther was not an imposing figure as he stood before the proud assembly in the imperial hall. He had just recovered from a severe fever, and was pale and emaciated, and standing there, unsupported by a single friend, before that great assembly, his feelings were strongly excited. The emperor remarked to his neighbour, "This man would never succeed in making a heretic of me." But though Luther's body was weak, his mind was strong. His air quickly became calm and dignified. He was commanded to retract the charges he had made against the Church. In reply, he acknowledged that the writings produced were his own, and declared that he was not ready to retract them, but said that "if they can convince me from the Holy Scriptures that I am in error, I am ready with my own hands to cast the whole of my writings into the flames." The Chancellor replied that what he demanded was retraction, not dispute. This Luther refused to give. The Emperor insisted on a simple recantation, which Luther declared he could not make. For several days the hearing continued, ending at length in the threatening declaration of the Emperor that he would no longer listen to Luther, but dismiss him at once from his presence, and treat him as he would a heretic. There was danger in this, the greatest danger. The Emperor's word had been given, it is true, but an Emperor had broken his word with John Huss, and his successor might with Martin Luther. Charles was indeed importuned to do so, but replied that his imperial word was sacred, even if given to a heretic, and that Luther should have an extension of the safe conduct for 21 days during his return home. Luther started home. It was a journey by no means free from danger. He had powerful and unscrupulous enemies. He might be seized and carried off by an ambush of his foes. How he was saved from peril of this sort we have described. It was his friend and protector, Frederick, the Elector of Saxony, who had placed the ambush of knights, his purpose being to put Luther in a place of safety where he could lie concealed until the feeling against him had subsided. Meanwhile, at Worms, when the period of safe conduct had expired, Luther was declared out of the ban of the Empire, an outlaw whom no man was permitted to shelter. His works were condemned to be burned wherever found, and he was adjudged to be seized and held in durance subject to the will of the Emperor. What had become of the fugitive no one knew. The story spread that he had been murdered by his enemies. For 10 months he remained in concealment, and when again he appeared, it was to combat a horde of fanatical enthusiasts who had carried his doctrines to excess, and were stirring up all Germany by their wild opinions. The outbreak drew Luther back to Wittenberg, where for 8 days he preached with great eloquence against the fanatics, and finally succeeded in quelling the disturbance. From that time forward, Luther continued the guiding spirit of the Protestant revolt, and was looked upon with high consideration by most of the princes of Germany, his doctrines spreading until, during his lifetime, they extended to Moravia, Bohemia, Denmark, and Sweden. Then, in 1546, he died at Eisleben, near the castle in which he had dwelt during the most critical period of his life. End of Chapter 22. Chapter 23 of Historical Tales, Volume 5, German. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Historical Tales, Volume 5, German, by Charles Morris. Chapter 23, Soliman the Magnificent at Gunz. Soliman the Magnificent, Sultan of Turkey, had collected an army of dimensions as magnificent as his name, and was on his march to overwhelm Austria and perhaps subject all Western Europe to his arms. A few years before he had swept Hungary with his hordes, taken and plundered its cities of Buda and Pest, and made the whole region his own. Belgrade, which had been so valiantly defended against his predecessor, had fallen into his infidel hands. The gateways of Western Europe were his, he had but to open them and march through. Doubtless there had come to him glorious dreams of extending the empire of the Crescent to the western seas. And yet the proud and powerful Sultan was to be checked in his course by an obstacle seemingly as insignificant as if the sting of a hornet should stop the career of an elephant. The story is a remarkable one, and deserves to be better known. Vast was the army which Soliman raised. He had been years in gathering men and equipments. Great work lay before him, and he needed great means for its accomplishment. It is said that 300,000 men marched under his banners. So large was the force, so great the quantity of its baggage and artillery, that its progress was necessarily a slow one, and 60 days elapsed during its march from Constantinople to Belgrade. Here was time for Ferdinand of Austria to bring together forces for the defence of his dominions against the Leviathan which was slowly moving upon them. He made efforts, but they were not of the energetic sort which the crisis demanded, and had the Turkish army been less unwieldy and more rapid, Vienna might have fallen almost undefended into Soliman's hands. Fortunately, large bodies moved slowly, and the Sultan met with an obstacle that gave the requisite time for preparation. On to Belgrade swept the grand army with its multitude of standards and all the pomp and glory of its vast array. The slowness with which it came was due solely to its size, not in any sense to lack of energy in the warlike Sultan. An anecdote is extant which shows his manner of dealing with difficulties. He had sent forward an engineer with orders to build a bridge over the river Drave, to be constructed at a certain point, and to be ready at a certain time. The engineer went, surveyed the rapid stream, and sent back answer to the Sultan that it was impossible to construct a bridge at that point. But Soliman's was one of those magnificent souls that do not recognize the impossible. He sent the messenger back to the engineer, in his hand a linen cord, on his lips this message: "Your master, the Sultan, commands you, without consideration of the difficulties, to complete the bridge over the Drave. If it be not ready for him on his arrival, he will have you strangled with this cord." The bridge was built. Soliman had learned the art of overcoming the impossible. He was soon to have a lesson in the art of overcoming the difficult. Belgrade was in due time reached. Here the Sultan embarked his artillery and heavy baggage on the Danube, 3,000 vessels being employed for that purpose. They were sent down the stream, under sufficient escort, towards the Austrian capital, while the main army, lightened of much of its load, prepared to march more expeditiously than heretofore through Hungary towards its goal. Ferdinand of Austria, alarmed at the threatening approach of the Turks, had sent rich presents and proposals of peace to Soliman at Belgrade, but those had the sole effect of increasing his pride and making him more confident of victory. He sent an insulting order to the ambassadors to follow his encampment and await his pleasure, and paid no further heed to their pacific mission. The Save, an affluent of the Danube, was crossed, and the army lost sight of the great stream, and laid its course by a direct route through Sclavonia towards the borders of Styria, the outlying Austrian province, in that direction. It was the shortest line of march available, the distance to be covered about 200 miles. On reaching the Styrian frontier, the Illyrian mountain chain needed to be crossed, and within it lay the obstacle with which Soliman had to contend. The route of the army led through a mountain pass. In this pass was a petty and obscure town, Gunz by name, badly fortified and garrisoned by a mere handful of men, 800 in all. Its principal means of defence lay in the presence of an indomitable commander, Nicholas Yurisitz, a man of iron nerve and fine military skill. Ibrahim Pasha, who led the vanguard of the Turkish force, ordered the occupation of this mountain fortress, and learned with anger and mortification that Gunz had closed its gates, and frowned defiance on his men. Word was sent back to Soliman, who probably laughed in his beard at the news. It was as if a fly had tried to stop an ox. Brush it away and push onward was probably the tenor of his orders. But Gunz was not to be brushed away. It stood there like an awkward fact, its guns commanding the pass through which the army must march, a ridiculous obstacle which had to be dealt with, however time might press. The Sultan sent orders to his advanced guard to take the town and march on. Ibrahim Pasha pushed forward, assailed it, and found that he had not men enough for the work. The little town, with its little garrison, had the temper of a shrew, and held its own against him valiantly. A few more battalions were sent, but still the town held out. The Sultan, enraged at this opposition, now dispatched what he considered an overwhelming force, with orders to take the town without delay, and to punish the garrison as they deserved for their foolish obstinacy. But what was his surprise and fury to receive word that the pygmy still held out stubbornly against the Leviathan, that all their efforts to take it were in vain, and that its guns commanded and swept the pass so that it was impossible to advance under its storm of death-dealing balls. Thundering vengeance, Soliman now ordered his whole army to advance, sweep that insolent and annoying obstacle from the face of the earth, and then march on towards the real goal of their enterprise, the still distant city of Vienna, the capital and stronghold of the Christian dogs. Upon Gunst burst the whole storm of the war. Against Gunst it thundered. Around Gunst it lightened. Yet still Gunst stood, proud, insolent, defiant, like a rock in the midst of the sea, battered by the waves of war's tempest, yet rising still in unyielding strength, and dashing back the bloody spray which lashed its walls in vain. Soliman's pride was roused. That town he must and would have. He might have marched past it and left it in the rear, though not without great loss and danger, for the pass was narrow, and commanded by the guns of Gunst. He would have had to run the gauntlet of the hailstorm of iron balls. But he had no thought of passing it. His honour was involved. Gunst must be his and its insolent garrison punished, or how could Soliman the Magnificent ever hold up his head among monarchs and conquerors again? On every side the town was assailed. Cannon surrounded it, and poured their balls upon its walls. They were planted on the hills in its rear. They were planted on lofty mounds of earth which overtopped its walls and roofs. From every direction they thundered threat. To every direction Gunst thundered back defiance. An attempt was made to undermine the walls, but in vain. The commandant, Eurycitz, was far too vigilant to be reached by burrowing. Breach after breach was made in the walls, and as quickly repaired, or new walls built. Assault after assault was made and hurled back. Every effort was baffled by the skill, vigour, and alertness of the governor, and the unyielding courage of his men, and still the days went by, and still Gunst stood. Soliman, indignant and alarmed, tried the effect of promises, bribes, and threats. Eurycitz and his garrison should be enriched if they yielded, they should die under torture if they persisted. These efforts proved as useless as cannon balls. The indomitable Eurycitz resisted promises and threats as energetically as he had resisted shots and balls. The days went on. For 28 days that insignificant fortress and its handful of men defied the great Turkish army and held it back in that mountain pass. In the end the Sultan, with all his pride and all his force, was obliged to accept a feigned submission and leave Eurycitz and his men still in possession of the fortress they had held so long and so well. They had held it long enough to save Austria, as it proved. While the Sultan's cannon were vainly bombarding its walls, Europe was gathering around Vienna in defence. From every side troops hurried to the salvation of Austria from the Turks. Italy, the Netherlands, Bohemia, Poland, Germany, sent their quotas, till an army of 130,000 men were gathered around Vienna, 30,000 of them being cavalry. Soliman was appalled at the tidings brought him. It had become a question of arithmetic to his barbarian intellect. If Gunst, with less than 1,000 men, could defy him for a month, what might not Vienna do with more than 100,000? Winter was not far away. It was already September. He was separated from his flotilla of artillery. Was it safe to advance? He answered the question by suddenly striking camp, and retreating with such haste that his marauding horsemen, who were out in large numbers, were left in ignorance of the movement, and were nearly all taken or cut to pieces. Thus ingloriously ended one of the most pretentious invasions of Europe. For 3 years Soliman had industriously prepared, gathered the resources of his wide dominion to the task, and fulminating infinite disaster to the infidels. Yet 800 men, in a petty mountain town, had brought this great enterprise to naught, and sent back the mighty army of the Grand Turk in inglorious retreat. The story of Gunst has few parallels in history. The courage and ability of its commander were of the highest type of military worthiness. Yet its story is almost unknown, and the name of Eurycitz is not classed among those of the world's heroes. Such is fame. There is another interesting story of the doings of Soliman and the gallant defence of a Christian town, which is worthy of telling as an appendix to that just given. The assault at Gunst took place in the year 1532. In 1566, when Soliman was much older, though perhaps not much wiser, we find him at his old work, engaged in besieging the small Hungarian town of Szigeth, west of Mohacs and north of the river Drave, a stronghold surrounded by the small stream Almas almost as by the waters of a lake. It was defended by a Croatian named Srinir and a garrison of 2,500 men. Around this town the Turkish army raged and thundered in its usual fashion. Within it the garrison defended themselves with all the spirit and energy they could muster. Step by step the Turks advanced. The outskirts of the town were destroyed by fire, and the assailants were within its walls. The town being no longer tenable, Zrynir took refuge with what remained of the garrison in the fortress, and still bade defiance to his foes. Soliman, impatient at the delay caused by the obstinacy of the defender, tried with him the same tactics he had employed with Eurysithus many years before, those of threats and promises. Tempting offers of wealth proving of no avail, the Sultan threatened the bold commander with the murder of his son George, a prisoner in his hands. This proved equally unavailing, and the siege went on. It went on, indeed, until Soliman was himself vanquished, and by an enemy he had not taken into account in his thirst for glory, the grim warrior Death. Temper killed him. In a fit of passion he suddenly died. But the siege went on. The Vizier concealed his death, and kept the batteries at work, perhaps deeming it best for his own fortunes to be able to preface the announcement of the Sultan's death with a victory. The castle walls had been already crumbling under the storm of balls. Soon they were in ruins. The place was no longer tenable. Yet Zrynir was as far as ever from thoughts of surrender. He dressed himself in his most magnificent garments, filled his pockets with gold, that they might find something on his corpse, and dashed on the Turks at the head of what soldiers were left. He died, but not unrevenged. Only after his death was the Turkish army told that their great Sultan was no more, and that they owed their victory to the shadow of the genius of Soliman the Magnificent. End of Chapter 23. Chapter 24 of Historical Tales, Volume 5, German. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Historical Tales, Volume 5, German, by Charles Morris. Chapter 24. The Peasants and the Anabaptists. Germany, in great part, under the leadership of Martin Luther, had broken loose from the Church of Rome, the ball which he had set rolling being kept in motion by other hands. The ideas of many of those who followed him were full of the spirit of fanaticism. The pendulum of religious thought, set in free swing, vibrated from the one extreme of authority to the opposite extreme of license, going as far beyond Luther as he had gone beyond Rome. There arose a sect to which was given the name of Anabaptists, from its rejection of infant baptism, a sect with a strange history, which it now falls to us to relate. The new movement, indeed, was not confined to matters of religion. The idea of freedom from authority, once set afloat, quickly went further than its advocates intended. If men were to have liberty of thought, why should they not have liberty of action? So argued the peasantry, and not without the best of reasons, for they were pitifully oppressed by the nobility, weighed down with feudal exactions to support the luxury of the higher classes, their crops destroyed by the horses and dogs of hunting parties, their families ill-treated and insulted by the men-at-arms who were maintained at their expense, their flight from tyranny to the freedom of the cities prohibited by nobles and citizens alike, everywhere enslaved, everywhere despised. It is no wonder they joined with gladness in the revolutionary sentiment, and made a vigorous demand for political liberty. As a result of all this, an insurrection broke out, a double insurrection, in fact, here of the peasantry for their rights, there of the religious fanatics for their license. Suddenly all Germany was upturned by the greatest and most dangerous outbreak of the laboring classes it had ever known, a revolt which, had it been ably led, might have revolutionized society and founded a completely new order of things. In 1522 the standard of revolt was first raised, its signal a golden shoe with the motto, "Whoever will be free, let him follow this ray of light." In 1524 a fresh insurrection broke out, and in the spring of the following year the whole country was aflame, the peasants of southern Germany being everywhere in arms and marching on the strongholds of their oppressors. Their demands were by no means extreme. They asked for a board of arbitration, to consist of the Archduke Ferdinand, the Elector of Saxony, Luther, Melanchthon, and several preachers, to consider their proposed articles of reform in industrial and political concerns. These articles covered the following points. They asked the right to choose their own pastors, who were to preach the word of God from the Bible; the abolition of dues except tithes to the clergy; the abolition of vassalage; the rights of hunting and fishing, and of cutting woods in the forests; reforms in rent, in the administration of justice, and in the methods of application of the laws; the restoration of communal property illegally seized, and several other matters of the same general character. They asked in vain. The princes ridiculed the idea of a court in which Luther should sit side by side with the Archduke. Luther refused to interfere. He admitted the oppression of the peasantry, severely attacked the princes and nobility for their conduct, but deprecated the excesses which the insurgents had already committed, and saw no safety from worse evils except in putting down the peasantry with a strong hand. The rejection of the demands of the rebellious peasants was followed by a frightful reign of license, political in the south, religious in the north. Everywhere the people were in arms, destroying castles, burning monasteries, and forcing numbers of the nobles to join them, under pain of having their castles plundered and burned. The Counts of Hohenlohe were made to enter their ranks, and were told, "Brother Albert and Brother George, you are no longer lords, but peasants, and we are the lords of Hohenlohe." Other nobles were similarly treated. Various Swabian nobles fled for safety with their families and treasures to the city and castle of Weinsberg. The castle was stormed and taken, and the nobles, 70 in number, were forced to run the gauntlet between two lines of men armed with spears, who stabbed them as they passed. It was this deed that brought out a pamphlet from Luther, in which he called on all the citizens of the empire to put down the furious peasantry, to strangle, to stab them, secretly and openly as they can, as one would kill a mad dog. There was need for something to be done, if Germany was to be saved from a revolution. The numbers of the insurgents steadily increased. Many of the cities were in league with them. Several of the princes entered in negotiation concerning their demands. In Thuringia, the Anabaptists, under the lead of a fanatical preacher named Thomas Münzer, were in full revolt. In Saxony, Hesse, and Lower Germany, the peasantry were in arms. There was much reason to fear that the insurgents and fanatics would join their forces and pour like a rushing torrent through the whole empire, destroying all before them. Of the many peasant revolts which the history of medievalism records, this was the most threatening and dangerous, and called for the most strenuous exertions to save the institutions of Germany from a complete overthrow. At the head of the main body of insurgents was a knight of notorious character, the famed Götz von Berlichingen, Götz with the iron hand, as he is named, a robber baron whose history had been one of feud and contest, and of the plunder alike of armed foes and unarmed travellers. Goethe has honoured him by making him the hero of a drama, and the peasantry sought to honour him by making him the leader of their march of destruction. This worthy had lost his hand during youth, and replaced it with a hand of iron. He was bold, daring, and unscrupulous, but scarcely fitted for generalship, his knowledge of war being confined to the tactics of highway robbery. Nor can it be said that his leadership of the peasants was voluntary. He was as much their prisoner as their general, his service being an enforced one. With the redoubtable Götz at their head, the insurgents poured onward, spreading terror before them, leaving ruin behind them. Castles and monasteries were destroyed, until throughout Thuringia, Franconia, Swabia, and along the Rhine, as far as Lorraine, the homes of lords and clergy were destroyed, and a universal scene of smoking ruins replaced the formerly stately architectural piles. We cannot go further into the details of this notable outbreak. The revolt of the southern peasantry was at length brought to an end by an army collected by the Swabian League, and headed by George Truchsess of Waldburg. Had they marched against him in force, he could not have withstood their onset, but they occupied themselves in sieges, disregarding the advice of their leaders, and permitted themselves to be attacked and beaten in detail. Seeing that all was at an end, Götz von Berlichingen secretly fled from their ranks and took refuge in his castle. Many of the bodies of peasantry dispersed. Others made head against the troops and were beaten with great slaughter. All was at an end. Truchsess held a terrible court of justice in the city of Würzburg, in which his jester Hans acted as executioner, and struck off the heads of numbers of the prisoners, the bloody work being attended with laughter and jests, which added doubly to its horror. All who acknowledged that they had read the Bible, or even that they knew how to read and write, were instantly beheaded. The priest of Schipf, a gouty old man who had vigorously opposed the peasants, had himself carried by 4 of his men to Truchsess to receive thanks for his services. Hans, fancying that he was one of the rebels, slipped up behind him, and in an instant his head was rolling on the floor. "I seriously reproved my good Hans for his untoward jest," was the easy comment of Truchsess upon this circumstance. Throughout Germany, similar slaughter of the peasantry and wholesale executions took place. In many places the reprisal took the dimensions of a massacre, and it is said that by the end of the frightful struggle more than 100,000 of the peasants had been slain. As for its political results, the survivors were reduced to a deeper state of servitude than before. Thus ended a great struggle which had only needed an able leader to make it a success and to free the people from feudal bonds. It ended, like all the peasant outbreaks, in defeat and renewed oppression. As for the robber chief Goetz, while he is said by several historians to have received a sentence of life imprisonment, Menzel states that he was retained in prison for 2 years only. In Thuringia, as we have said, the revolt was a religious one, it being controlled by Thomas Münzer, a fanatical Anabaptist. He pretended that he had the gift of receiving divine revelations, and claimed to be better able to reveal Christian truth than Luther. God had created the earth, he said, for believers. All government should be regulated by the Bible and revelation, and there was no need of princes, priests, or nobles. The distinction between rich and poor was unchristian, since in God's kingdom all should be alike. Nicholas Storch, one of Münzer's preachers, surrounded himself with 12 apostles and 72 disciples, and claimed that an angel brought him divine messages. Driven from Saxony by the influence of Luther, Münzer went to Thuringia, and gained such control by his preaching and his doctrines over the people of the town of Mühlhausen that all the wealthy people were driven away, their property confiscated, and the sole control of the place fell into his hands. So great was the disturbance caused by his fanatical teachings and the exertions of his disciples, that Luther again bestirred himself, and called on the princes for the suppression of Münzer and his fanatical horde. A division of the army was sent into Thuringia, and came up with a large body of the Anabaptists near Frankenhausen on May 15, 1525. Münzer was in command of the peasants. The army officers, hoping to bring them to terms by lenient measures, offered to pardon them if they would give up their leaders and peacefully retire to their homes. This offer might have been effective but for Münzer, who, foreseeing danger to himself, did his utmost to awaken the fanaticism of his followers. It happened that a rainbow appeared in the heavens during the discussion. This, he declared, was a messenger sent to him from God. His ignorant audience believed him, and for the moment were stirred up to a mad enthusiasm which banished all thoughts of surrender. Rushing in their fury on the ambassadors of peace and pardon, they stabbed them to death, and then took shelter behind their entrenchments, where they prepared for a vigorous defence. Their courage, however, did not long endure the vigorous assault made by the troops of the Elector. In vain they looked for the host of angels which Münzer had promised would come to their aid. Not the glimpse of an angel's wing appeared in the sky. Münzer himself took to flight, and his infatuated followers, their blind courage vanished, fell an easy prey to the swords of the soldiers. The greater part of the peasant horde were slain, while Münzer, who had concealed himself from pursuit in the loft of a house in Frankenhausen, was quickly discovered, dragged forth, put to the rack, and beheaded, his death putting an end to that first phase of the Anabaptist outbreak. After this event several years passed, during which the Anabaptists kept quiet, though their sect increased. Then came one of the most remarkable religious revolts which history records. Persecution in Germany had caused many of the new sectarians to emigrate to the Netherlands, where their preachings were effective, and many new members were gained. But the persecution instigated by Charles V. against heretics in the Netherlands fell heavily upon them, and gave rise to a new emigration, great numbers of the Anabaptists now seeking the town of Münster, the capital of Westphalia. The citizens of this town had expelled their bishop, and had in consequence been treated with great severity by Luther, in his effort to keep the cause of religious form separate from politics. The newcomers were received with enthusiasm, and the people of Münster quickly fell under the influence of two of their fanatical preachers, John Matthiessen, a baker of Haarlem, and John Bockhold, or Bockelson, a tailor of Leyden. Münster soon became the seat of an extraordinary outburst of profligacy, fanaticism, and folly. The Anabaptists took possession of the town, drove out all its wealthy citizens, elected two of themselves, a clothier named Knipperdolling and one Krechting, as burgomasters, and started off in a remarkable career of self-government under Anabaptist auspices. A community of property was the first measure inaugurated. Every person was required to deposit all his possessions in gold, silver, and other articles of value in a public treasury, which fell under the control of Bockelson, who soon made himself lord of the city. All the images, pictures, ornaments, and books of the churches, except their Bibles, were publicly burned. All persons were obliged to eat together at public tables, all made to work according to their strength and without regard to their former station, and a general condition of communism was established. Bockelson gave himself out as a prophet, and quickly gained such influence over the people that they were ready to support him in the utmost excesses of folly and profligacy. One of the earliest steps taken was to authorize each man to possess several wives, the number of women who had sought Münster being 6 times greater than the men. John Bockelson set the example by marrying 3 at once. His licentious example was quickly followed by others, and for a full year the town continued a scene of unbridled profligacy and mad license. One of John's partisans, claiming to have received a divine communication, saluted him as monarch of the whole globe, the King of Righteousness, his title of royalty being John of Leyden, and declared that Heaven had chosen him to restore the throne of David. 28 apostles were selected and sent out, charged to preach the new gospel to the whole earth, and to bring its inhabitants to acknowledge the divinely commissioned king. Their success was not great, however. Wherever they went they were seized and immediately executed, the earth showing itself very unwilling to accept John of Leyden as its king. In August 1534 an army led by Francis of Waldeck, the expelled bishop, who was supported by the Landgrave of Hesse and several other princes, advanced and laid siege to the city, which the Anabaptists defended with furious zeal. In the first assault, which was made on August 30th, the assailants were repulsed with severe loss. They then settled down to the slower but safer process of siege, considering it easier to starve out than to fight out their enthusiastic opponents. One of the 2 leaders of the citizens, John Matthiessen, made a sortie against the troops with only 30 followers, filled with the idea that he was a second Gideon, and that God would come to his aid to defeat the oppressors of his chosen people. The aid expected did not come, and Matthiessen and his followers were all cut down. His death left John of Leyden supreme. He claimed absolute authority in the new Zion, received daily fresh visions from heaven, which his followers implicitly believed and obeyed, and indulged in wild excesses, which only the insane enthusiasm of his followers kept them from viewing with disgust. Among his mad freaks was that of running around the streets naked, shouting, "The King of Zion is come." His lieutenant, Knipperdolling, not to be outdone in fanaticism, followed his example, shouting, "Every high place shall be brought low." Immediately the mob assailed the churches and pulled down all the steeples. Those who ventured to resist the monarch's decrees were summarily dealt with, the block and axe, with Knipperdolling as headsman, quickly disposing of all doubters and rebels. Such was the doom of Elizabeth, one of the prophet's wives, who declared that she could not believe that God had condemned so many people to die of hunger, while their king was living in abundance. John beheaded her with his own hands in the market-place, and then in insane frenzy danced around her body in company with his other wives. Her loss was speedily repaired. The angels were kept busy in picking out new wives for the inspired tailor, till in the end he had 17 in all, one of whom, Divara by name, gained great influence by her spirit and beauty. While all this was going on within the city, the army of besiegers lay encamped about it, waiting patiently till famine should subdue the stubborn courage of the citizens. Numbers of nobles flocked thither by way of pastime, in the absence of any other wars to engage their attention. Nor were the citizens without aid from a distance. Parties of their brethren from Holland and Friesland sought to relieve them, but in vain. All their attempts were repelled, and the siege grew straiter than ever. The defence from within was stubborn, women and boys being enlisted in the service. The boys stood between the men and fired arrows effectively at the besiegers. The women poured lime and melted pitch upon their heads. So obstinate was the resistance that the city might have held out for years but for the pinch of famine. The effect of this was temporarily obviated by driving all the old men and the women who could be spared beyond the walls. But despite this, the grim figure of starvation came daily nearer and nearer, and the day of surrender or death steadily approached. A year at length went by, the famine growing in virulence with the passing of the days. Hundreds perished of starvation, yet still the people held out with a fanatical courage that defied assault. Still their king kept up their courage by divine revelations, and still he contrived to keep himself sufficiently supplied with food amid his starving dupes. At length the end came. Some of the despairing citizens betrayed the town by night to the enemy. On the night of June 25th, 1535, Two of them opened the gates to the bishop's army, and a sanguinary scene ensued. The betrayed citizens defended themselves desperately, and were not vanquished until great numbers of them had fallen, and the work of famine had been largely completed by the sword. John of Leyden was made prisoner, together with his two chief men, Kniperdoling, his executioner, and Krechting, his chancellor, they being reserved for a slower and more painful fate. For 6 months they were carried through Germany, enclosed in iron cages, and exhibited as monsters to the people. Then they were taken back to Münster, where they were cruelly tortured, and at length put to death by piercing their hearts with red-hot daggers. Their bodies were placed in iron cages, and suspended on the front of the church of St. Lambert, in the market-place of Münster, while the Catholic worship was re-established in that city. The cages and the instruments of torture are still preserved, probably as salutary examples to fanatics, or as interesting mementos of Münster's past history. The Münster madness was the end of trouble with the Anabaptists. They continued to exist in a quieter fashion, some of them that fled from persecution in Germany and Holland finding themselves exposed to almost as severe a persecution in England. As a sect they have long since vanished, while the only trace of their influence is to be seen in those recent sects that hold the doctrine of adult baptism. The history of mankind presents no parallel tale to that we have told. It was an instance of insanity placed in power, of lunacy ruling over ignorance and fanaticism, and the doings of John of Leyden in Münster may be presented as an example alike of the mad extremes to which unquestioned power is apt to lead, and the vast capabilities of faith and trust which exist in uneducated man. End of chapter 24. Chapter 25 of Historical Tales, Volume 5, German. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Historical Tales, Volume 5, German, by Charles Morris. Chapter 25 The Fortunes of Wallenstein. Wallenstein was in power. Wallenstein the mysterious, the ambitious, the victorious, soldier of fortune and arbiter of empires, reader of the stars and ally of the powers of darkness, poor by birth and rich by marriage and imperial favor, an extraordinary man surrounded by mystery and silence, victorious through ability and audacity, rising from obscurity to be master of the emperor, and falling at length by the hand of assassination. In person he was tall and thin, in countenance sallow and lowering, his eyes small and piercing, his forehead high and commanding, his hair short and bristling, his expression dark and sinister. Fortune was his deity, ambition ruled him with the sway of a tyrant. He was born with the conquering instinct, and in the end handed over all Germany, bound and captive, to his imperial master, and retired to brood new conquests. Albert von Wallenstein was Bohemian by birth, Prague being his native city. His parents were Lutherans, but they died, and he was educated as a Catholic. He travelled with an astrologer, and was taught cabalistic lore and the secrets of the stars, which he ever after believed to control his destiny. His fortune began in his marriage to an aged but very wealthy widow, who almost put an end to his career by administering to him a love potion. He had already served in the army, fought against the Turks in Hungary, and with his wife's money raised a regiment for the wars in Bohemia. A second marriage with a rich countess added to his wealth. He purchased, at a fifth of their value, about 60 estates of the exiled Bohemian nobility, and paid for them in debased coin. The emperor, in recognition of his services, made him Duke of Friedland, in which alone there were 9 towns and 57 castles and villages. His wealth, through these marriages, purchases, and gifts, steadily increased till he became enormously rich, and the wealthiest man in Germany next to the emperor. This extraordinary man was born in an extraordinary time, a period admirably calculated for the exercise of his talents, and sadly suited to the suffering of mankind in consequence. It was the period of the frightful conflict known as the 30 Years' War. A century had passed since the Diet of Worms, in which Protestantism first boldly lifted its head against Catholicism. During that period the new religious doctrines had gained a firm footing in Germany. Charles V. had done his utmost to put them down, and, discouraged by his failure, had abdicated the throne. In his retreat he is said to have amused his leisure in seeking to make 2 watches go precisely alike. The effort proved as vain as that to make 2 people think alike, and he exclaimed, Not even two watches with similar works can I make to agree, and yet, fool that I was, I thought I should be able to control like the works of a watch different nations, living under diverse skies, in different climes, and speaking varied languages. Those who followed him were to meet with similar result. The second effort to put down Protestantism by arms began in 1618, and led to that frightful outbreak of human virulence, the 30 Years' War, which made Germany a desert, but left religion as it found it. The Emperor Ferdinand II., a rigid Catholic, bitterly opposed to the spread of Protestantism, had ordered the demolition of 2 new churches built by the Bohemian Protestants. His order led to instant hostilities. Count Thurn, a fierce Bohemian nobleman, had the Emperor's representatives, Slavata and Martinitz by name, flung out of the window of the council chamber in Prague, a height of 70 or more feet, and their secretary Fabricius flung after them. It was a terrible fall, but they escaped, for a pile of litter and old papers lay below. Fabricius fell on Martinitz, and, polite to the last, begged his pardon for coming down upon him so rudely. This act of violence, which occurred on May 23rd, 1618, is looked upon as the true beginning of the dreadful war. Matters moved rapidly. Bohemia was conquered by the imperial armies, its nobles exiled or executed, its religion suppressed. This victory gained, an effort was made to suppress Lutheranism in Upper Austria. It led to a revolt, and soon the whole country was in flame of war. Tilly and Pappenheim, the imperial commanders, swept all before them, until they suddenly found themselves opposed by a man their equal in ability, Count Mansfeld, who had played an active part in the Bohemian wars. A diminutive, deformed, sickly-looking man was Mansfeld, but he had the soul of a soldier in his small frame. No sooner was his standard raised than the Protestants flocked to it, and he quickly found himself at the head of 20,000 men. But as the powerful princes failed to support him, he was compelled to subsist his troops by pillage, an example which was followed by all the leaders during that dreadful contest. And now began a frightful struggle, a game of war on the chessboard of a nation, in which the people were the helpless pawns, and suffered alike from friends and foes. Neither side gained any decisive victory, but both sides plundered and ravaged, the savage soldiery, unrestrained and unrestrainable, committing cruel excesses wherever they came. Such was the state of affairs which preceded the appearance of Wallenstein on the field of action. The soldiers led by Tilly were those of the Catholic League. Ferdinand, the Emperor, had no troops of his own in the field. Wallenstein, discontented that the war should be going on without him, offered to raise an imperial army, paying the most of its expenses himself, but stipulating in return that he should have unlimited control. The Emperor granted all his demands, and made him Duke of Friedland as a preliminary reward, Wallenstein agreeing to raise 10,000 men. No sooner was his standard raised than crowds flocked to it, and an army of 40,000 soldiers of fortune were soon ready to follow him to plunder and victory. His fame as a soldier, and the free pillage which he promised, had proved irresistible inducements to war-loving adventurers of all nations and creeds. In a few months the army was raised and fully equipped, and in the autumn of 1625 took the field, growing as it marched. Christian IV., the Lutheran king of Denmark, had joined in the war, and Tilly, jealous of Wallenstein, vigorously sought to overcome his new adversaries before his rival could reach the field of conflict. He succeeded, too, in great measure, reducing many of the Protestant towns, and routing the army of the Danish king. Meanwhile Wallenstein came on, his army growing until 60,000 men, a wild and undisciplined horde, followed his banners. Mansfeld, who had received reinforcements from England and Holland, opposed him, but was too weak to face him successfully in the field. He was defeated on the bridge of Dessau, and marched rapidly into Silesia, whither Wallenstein, much to his chagrin, was compelled to follow him. From Silesia Mansfeld marched into Hungary, still pursued by Wallenstein. Here he was badly received, because he had not brought the money expected by the king. His retreat cut off, and without the means of procuring supplies in that remote country, the valiant warrior found himself at the end of his resources. Return was impossible, for Wallenstein occupied the roads. In the end he was forced to sell his artillery and ammunition, disband his army, and proceed southward towards Venice, whence he hoped to reach England and procure a new supply of funds. But on arriving at the village of Urakovitz in Bosnia, his strength, worn out by incessant struggles and fatigues, gave way, and the noble warrior, the last hope of Protestantism in Germany, as it seemed, breathed his last, a disheartened fugitive. On feeling the approach of death, he had himself clothed in his military coat and his sword buckled to his side. Thus equipped, and standing between two friends, who supported him upright, the brave Mansfeld breathed his last. His death left his cause almost without a supporter, for the same year his friend, Duke Christian of Brunswick, expired, and with them the Protestants lost their only able leaders, King Christian of Denmark, their principal successor, being greatly wanting in the requisites of military genius. Ferdinand seemed triumphant, and the cause of his opponents lost. All opposition for the time was at an end. Tilly, whose purposes were the complete restoration of Catholicism in Germany, held the provinces conquered by him with an iron hand. Wallenstein, who seemingly had in view the weakening of the power of the League and the raising of the Emperor to absolutism, broke down all opposition before his irresistible march. His army had gradually increased till it numbered 100,000 men, a host which it cost him nothing to support, for it subsisted on the devastated country. He advanced through Silesia, driving all his enemies before him, marched into Holstein in order to force the King of Denmark to leave Germany, invaded and devastated Jutland and Silesia, and added to his immense estate the Duchy of Sagan and the whole of Mecklenburg, which latter was given him by the Emperor in payment of his share of the expenses of the war. This raised him to the rank of a prince. As for Denmark, he proposed to get rid of its king and have Ferdinand elected in his stead. The career of this incomprehensible man had been strangely successful. Not a shadow of reverse had met him. What he really intended no one knew. As his enemies decreased, he increased his forces. Was it the absolutism of the Emperor or of himself that he sought? Several of the princes appealed to Ferdinand to relieve their dominions from the oppressive burden of war, but the Emperor was weaker than his general, and dared not act against him. The whole of North Germany lay prostrate beneath the powerful warrior, and obeyed his slightest nod. He lived in a style of pomp and ostentation far beyond that of the Emperor himself. His officers imitated him in extravagance. Even his soldiers lived in luxury. To support this lavish display, many thousands of human beings languished in misery, starvation threatened whole provinces, and destitution everywhere prevailed. From Mecklenburg, Wallenstein fixed his ambitious eyes on Pomerania, which territory he grew desirous of adding to his dominions. Here was an important commercial city, Stralsund, a member of the Hanseatic League, and one which enjoyed the privilege of self-government. It had contributed freely to the expenses of the imperial army, but Wallenstein, in furtherance of his designs upon Pomerania, now determined to place in it a garrison of his own troops. This was an interference with their vested rights which roused the wrath of the citizens of Stralsund. They refused to receive the troops sent them. Wallenstein, incensed, determined to teach the insolent burghers a lesson, and bade General Arnim to march against and lay siege to the place, doubting not that it would be quickly at his mercy. He was destined to a disappointment. Stralsund was to put the first check upon his uniformly successful career. The citizens defended their walls with obstinate courage. Troops, ammunition, and provisions were sent them from Denmark and Sweden, and they continued to oppose a successful resistance to every effort to reduce them. This unlooked-for perversity of the Stralsunders filled the soul of Wallenstein with rage. It seemed to him unexampled insolence that these merchants should dare defy his conquering troops. "Even if this Stralsund be linked by chains to the very heavens above," he declared, "still I swear it shall fall." He advanced in person against the city, and assailed it with his whole army, bringing all the resources at his command to bear against its walls. But with heroic courage the citizens held their own. Weeks passed, while he continued to thunder upon it with shot and shell. The Stralsunders thundered back. His most furious assaults were met by them with a desperate valour, which in time left his ranks 12,000 men short. In the end, to his unutterable chagrin, he was forced to raise the siege and march away, leaving the valiant burghers lords of their homes. The war now seemingly came to its conclusion. The King of Denmark asked for peace, which the Emperor granted, and terms were signed at Lübeck on May 12, 1629. The contest was, for the time being, at an end, for there was no longer anyone to oppose the Emperor. For 12 years it had continued, its ravages turning rich provinces into deserts, and making beggars and fugitives of wealthy citizens. The opposition of the Protestants was at an end, and there were but two disturbing elements of the seemingly pacific situation. One of these was the purpose which the Catholic party soon showed to suppress Protestantism and bring what they considered the heretical provinces again under the dominion of the Pope. The other was the army of Wallenstein, whose intolerable tyranny over friends and foes alike had now passed the bounds of endurance. From all sides complaints reached the Emperor's ears, charges of pillage, burnings, outrages, and shameful oppressions of every sort inflicted by the imperial troops upon the inhabitants of the land. So many were the complaints that it was impossible to disregard them. The whole body of princes, every one of whom cordially hated Wallenstein, joined in the outcry, and in the end Ferdinand, with some hesitation, yielded to their wishes and bade the general to disband his forces. Would he obey? That was next to be seen. The mighty chief was in a position to defy princes and emperor if he chose. The plundering bands who followed him were his own, not the emperor's soldiers. They knew but one master, and were ready to obey his slightest word. Had he given the order to advance upon Vienna and drive the emperor himself from his throne, there is no question but that they would have obeyed. As may be imagined, then, the response of Wallenstein was awaited in fear and anxiety. Should ambition counsel him to revolution, the very foundations of the empire might be shaken. What, then, was the delight of princes and people when word came that he had accepted the emperor's command without a word, and at once ordered the disbanding of his troops. The stars were perhaps responsible for this. Astrology was his passion, and the planetary conjunctions seemed then to be in favor of submission. The man was superstitious, with all his clear-sighted ability, and permitted himself to be governed by influences which have long since lost their force upon men's minds. "I do not complain against or reproach the emperor," he said to the imperial deputies. "The stars have already indicated to me that the spirit of the Elector of Bavaria holds sway in the imperial councils. But his Majesty, in dismissing his troops, is rejecting the most precious jewel of his crown." The event which we have described took place in September 1630. Wallenstein, having paid off and dispersed his great army to the four winds, retired to his duchy of Friedland, and took up his residence at Gitschen, which had been much enlarged and beautified by his orders. Here he quietly waited and observed the progress of events. He had much of interest to observe. The effort of Ferdinand and his advisers to drive Protestantism out of Germany had produced an effect which none of them anticipated. The war, which had seemed at an end, was quickly afoot again, with a new leader of the Protestant cause, new armies, and new fortunes. Gustavus Adolphus, King of Sweden, had come to the rescue of his threatened fellow-believers, and before the army of Wallenstein had been dissolved, the work of the peacemakers was set aside, and the horrors of war returned. The dismissed general had now left Gitschen for Bohemia, where he dwelt upon his estates in a style of regal luxury, and in apparent disregard of the doings of emperors and kings. His palace in Prague was royal in its adornments, and while his enemies were congratulating themselves on having forced him into retirement, he had Italian artists at work painting on the walls of this palace his figure in the character of a conqueror, his triumphal car drawn by 4 milk-white steeds, while a star shone above his laurel-crowned head. 60 pages of noble birth, richly attired in blue and gold velvet, waited upon him, while some of his officers and chamberlains had served the emperor in the same rank. In his magnificent stables were 300 horses of choice breeds, while the daily gathering of distinguished men in his halls was not surpassed by the assemblies of the emperor himself. Yet in his demeanour there was nothing to show that he had entertained a shadow of his former ambition. He affected the utmost ease and tranquillity of manner, and seemed as if fully content with his present state, and as if he cared no longer who fought the wars of the world. But inwardly his ambition had in no sense declined. He beheld the progress of the Swedish conqueror with secret joy, and when he saw Tilly overthrown at Leipzig, and the fruits of 12 years of war wrested from the emperor at a single blow, his heart throbbed high with hope. His hour of revenge upon the emperor had come. Ferdinand must humiliate himself and come for aid to his dismissed general, for there was not another man in the kingdom capable of saving it from the triumphant foe. He was right. The emperor's deputies came. He was requested, begged, to head again the imperial armies. He received the envoys coldly. Urgent persuasions were needed to induce him to raise an army of 30,000 men. Even then he would not agree to take command of it. He would raise it, and put it at the Emperor's disposal. He planted his standard, the men came, many of them his old followers. Plenty and plunder were promised, and thousands flocked to his tents. By March of 1632 the 30,000 men were collected. Who should command them? There was but one, and this the Emperor and Wallenstein alike knew. They would follow only the man to whose banner they had flocked. The Emperor begged him to take command. He consented, but only on conditions to which an emperor has rarely agreed. Wallenstein was to have exclusive control of the army, without interference of any kind, was to be given irresponsible control over all the provinces he might conquer, was to hold as security a portion of the Austrian patrimonial estates, and after the war might choose any of the hereditary estates of the empire for his seat of retirement. The Emperor acceded, and Wallenstein, clothed with almost imperial power, marched to war. His subsequent fortunes the next narrative must declare. End of chapter 25. Chapter 26 of Historical Tales, Volume 5, German. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Historical Tales, Volume 5, German, by Charles Morris. Chapter 26. The End of Two Great Soldiers. Two armies faced each other in central Bavaria, two armies on which the fate of Germany depended, those of Gustavus Adolphus, the right hand of Protestantism, and Wallenstein, the hope of Catholic imperialism. Gustavus was strongly entrenched in the vicinity of Nuremberg, with an army of but 16,000 men. Wallenstein faced him with an army of 60,000, yet dared not attack him in his strong position. He occupied himself in efforts to make his camp as impregnable as that of his foemen, and the two great opponents lay waiting face to face, while famine slowly decimated their ranks. It was an extraordinary position. Both sides depended for food on foraging, and between them they had swept the country clean. The peasantry fled in every direction from Wallenstein's pillaging troops, who destroyed all that they could not carry away. It had become a question with the two armies which could starve the longest, and for 3 months they lay encamped, each waiting until famine should drive the other out. Surely such a situation had never before been known. What had preceded this event? A few words will tell. Ferdinand the Emperor had, with the aid of Tilly and Wallenstein, laid all Germany prostrate at his feet. Ferdinand the Zealot had, by this effort to impose Catholicism on the Protestant states, speedily undone the work of his generals, and set the war on foot again. Gustavus Adolphus, the hero of Sweden, had come to the aid of the oppressed Protestants of Germany, borne down all before him, and quickly won back northern Germany from the oppressor's hands. And now the cruelty of that savage war reached its culminating point. When Germany submitted to the Emperor, one city did not submit. Magdeburg still held out. All efforts to subdue it proved fruitless, and it continued free and defiant when all the remainder of Germany lay under the Emperor's control. It was to pay dearly for the courage of its citizens. When the war broke out again, Magdeburg was besieged by Tilly with his whole force. After a most valiant defence, it was taken by storm, and a scene of massacre and ruin followed without a parallel in modern wars. When it ended, Magdeburg was no more. Of its buildings all were gone except the cathedral and 137 houses. Of its inhabitants all had perished except some 4,000 who had taken refuge in the cathedral. Man, woman, and child, the sword had slain them all, Tilly being in considerable measure responsible for the massacre, for he was dilatory in ordering its cessation. When at length he did act, there was little to save. All Europe thrilled with horror at the dreadful news, and from that day forward fortune fled from the banners of Count Tilly. On September 7, 1631, the armies of Gustavus and Tilly met at Leipzig, and a terrible battle ensued, in which the Imperialists were completely defeated, and all the fruits of their former victories torn from their hands. In the following year Tilly had his thigh shattered by a cannon ball at the battle of Lech, and died in excruciating agonies. Such were the preludes to the scene we have described. The Lutheran princes everywhere joined the victorious Gustavus. Austria itself was threatened by his irresistible arms, and the Emperor, in despair, called Wallenstein again to the command, yielding to the most extreme demands of this imperious chief. The next scene was that we have described, in which the armies of Gustavus and Wallenstein lay face to face at Nuremberg, each waiting until starvation should force the other to fight or to retreat. Gustavus had sent for reinforcements, and his army steadily grew. That of Wallenstein dwindled away under the assaults of famine and pestilence. A large convoy of provisions intended for Wallenstein was seized by the Swedes. Soon afterwards Gustavus was so strongly reinforced that his army grew to 70,000 men. At his back lay Nuremberg, his faithful ally, ready to aid him with 30,000 fighting men besides. As his force grew, that of Wallenstein shrank, until by the end of the siege pestilence and want had reduced his army to 24,000 men. The Swedes were the first to yield in this game of starvation. As their numbers grew their wants increased, and at length, furious with famine, they made a desperate assault upon the imperial camp. They were driven back with heavy loss. 2 more weeks Gustavus waited, and then, despairing of drawing his opponent from his works, he broke camp and marched with sounding trumpets past his adversary's camp, who quietly let him go. The Swedes had lost 20,000 men, and Nuremberg 10,000 of her inhabitants, during this period of hunger and slaughter. This was in September 1632. In November of the same year the two armies met again, on the plain of Lützen, in Saxony, not far from the scene of Tilly's defeat a year before. Wallenstein, on the retreat of Gustavus, had set fire to his own encampment and marched away, burning the villages around Nuremberg, and wasting the country as he advanced, with Saxony as his goal. Gustavus, who had at first marched southward into the Catholic States, hastened to the relief of his allies. On the 15th of November the two great opponents came once more face to face, prepared to stake the cause of religious freedom in Germany on the issue of battle. Early in the morning of the 16th Gustavus marshalled his forces, determined that that day should settle the question of victory or defeat. Wallenstein had weakened his ranks by sending Count Pappenheim south on siege duty, and the Swedish king, without waiting for reinforcements, decided on an instant attack. Unluckily for him the morning dawned in fog. The entire plain lay shrouded. It was not until after 11 o'clock that the mist rose and the sun shone on the plain. During this interval Count Pappenheim, for whom Wallenstein had sent in haste the day before, was speeding north by forced marches, and through the chance of the fog was enabled to reach the field while the battle was at its height. The troops were drawn up in battle array, the Swedes singing to the accompaniment of drums and trumpets Luther's stirring hymn, and an ode composed by the king himself, "Fear not, thou little flock." They were strongly contrasted with the army of their foe, being distinguished by the absence of armor, lightly colored, chiefly blue, uniforms, quickness of motion, exactness of discipline, and the lightness of their artillery. The Imperialists, on the contrary, wore old-fashioned, close-fitting uniforms, mostly yellow in color, cuirasses, thigh-pieces, and helmets, and were marked by slow movements, absence of discipline, and the heaviness and unmanageable character of their artillery. The battle was to be, to some extent, a test of excellence between the new and the old ideas in war. At length the fog rose and the sun broke out, and both sides made ready for the struggle. Wallenstein, though suffering from a severe attack of his persistent enemy, the gout, mounted his horse and prepared his troops for the assault. His infantry were drawn up in squares, with the cavalry on their flanks, in front of a ditch defended by artillery. His purpose was defensive, that of Gustavus offensive. The Swedish king mounted in his turn, placed himself at the head of his right wing, and brandishing his sword, exclaimed, "Now onward! May our God direct us! Lord, Lord, help me this day to fight for the glory of thy name!" Then throwing aside his cuirass, which annoyed him on account of a slight wound he had recently received, he cried, "God is my shield!" and led his men in a furious charge upon the cannon-guarded ditch. The guns belched forth their deadly thunders. Many fell, but the remainder broke irresistibly over the defences and seized the battery, driving the Imperialists back in disorder. The cavalry, which had charged the black cuirassiers of Wallenstein, was less successful. They were repulsed, and the cuirassiers fiercely charged the Swedish infantry in flank, driving it back beyond the trenches. This repulse brought on the great disaster of the day. Gustavus, seeing his infantry driven back, hastened to their aid with a troop of horse, and through the disorder of the field became separated from his men, only a few of whom accompanied him, among them Francis, Duke of Saxe Lauenburg. His short-sightedness, or the foggy condition of the atmosphere, unluckily brought him too near a party of the black cuirassiers, and in an instant a shot struck him, breaking his left arm. "I am wounded, take me off the field," he said to the Duke of Lauenburg, and turned his horse to retire from the perilous vicinity. As he did so, a second ball struck him in the back. My God!" he exclaimed, falling from the saddle, while his horse, which had been wounded in the neck, dashed away, dragging the king, whose foot was entangled in the stirrup, for some distance. The Duke fled, but Luchau, the master of the royal horse, shot the officer who had wounded the king. The cuirassiers advanced, while Leubelfing, the king's page, a boy of 18, who had alone remained with him, was endeavouring to raise him up. "Who is he?" they asked. The boy refused to tell, and was shot and mortally wounded. "I am the King of Sweden," Gustavus is said to have exclaimed to his foes, who had surrounded and were stripping him. On hearing this they sought to carry him off, but a charge of the Swedish cavalry at that moment drove them from their prey. As they retired they discharged their weapons at the helpless king, one of the cuirassiers shooting him through the head as he rushed past his prostrate form. The sight of the king's charger, covered with blood, and galloping with empty saddle past their ranks, told the Swedes the story of the disastrous event. The news spread rapidly from rank to rank, carrying alarm wherever it came. Some of the generals wished to retreat, but Duke Bernhard of Weimar put himself at the head of a regiment, ran its colonel through for refusing to obey him, and called on them to follow him to revenge their king. His ardent appeal stirred the troops to new enthusiasm. Regardless of a shot that carried away his hat, Bernhard charged at their head, broke over the trenches and into the battery, retook the guns, and drove the imperial troops back in confusion, regaining all the successes of the first assault. The day seemed won. It would have been but for the fresh forces of Pappenheim, who had some time before reached the field, only to fall before the bullets of the foe. His men took an active part in the fray, and swept backward the tide of war. The Swedes were again driven from the battery and across the ditch, with heavy loss, and the imperialists regained the pivotal point of the obstinate struggle. But now the reserve corps of the Swedes, led by Kniphausen, came into action, and once more the state of the battle was reversed. They charged across the ditch with such irresistible force that the position was for the third time taken, and the imperialists again driven back. This ended the desperate contest. Wallenstein ordered the retreat to be sounded. The dead Gustavus had won the victory. A thick fog came on as night fell, and prevented pursuit, even if the weariness of the Swedes would have allowed it. They held the field, while Wallenstein hastened away, his direction of retreat being towards Bohemia. The Swedes had won and lost, for the death of Gustavus was equivalent to a defeat, and the emperor, with unseemly rejoicing, ordered a Te Deum to be sung in all his cities. On the following day the Swedes sought for the body of their king. They found it by a great stone, which is still known as the Swedish stone. It had been so trampled by the hoofs of charging horses, and was so covered with blood from its many wounds, that it was difficult to recognize. The collar, saturated with blood, which had fallen into the hands of the cuirassiers, was taken to Vienna and presented to the emperor, who is said to have shed tears on seeing it. The corpse was laid in state before the Swedish army, and was finally removed to Stockholm, where it was interred. Thus perished one of the great souls of Europe, a man stirred deeply by ambition, full of hopes greater than he himself acknowledged, a military hero of the first rank, and one disposed to prosecute war with a humanity far in advance of his age. He severely repressed all excesses of his soldiery, was solicitous for the security of citizens and peasantry, and strictly forbade any revengeful reprisals on Catholic cities for the frightful work done by his opponents upon the Protestants. Seldom has a conqueror shown such magnanimity and nobility of sentiment, and his untimely death had much to do with exposing Germany to the later desolation of that most frightful of religious wars. His defeated foe, Wallenstein, was not long to survive him. After his defeat he acted in a manner that gave rise to suspicions that he intended to play false to the emperor. He executed many of his officers and soldiers in revenge for their cowardice, as he termed it, recruited his ranks up to their former standard, but remained inactive, while Bernhard of Weimar was leading the Swedes to new successes. His actions were so problematical indeed that suspicion of his motives grew more decided, and at length a secret conspiracy was raised against him, with the connivance of the emperor. Wallenstein, as if fearful of an attempt to rob him of his power, had his superior officers assembled at a banquet given at Pilsen in January 1634. A fierce attack of gout prevented him from presiding, but his firm adherents, Field Marshals Illo and Terzka, took his place, and all the officers signed a compact to adhere faithfully to the Duke in life and death, as long as he should remain in the Emperor's service. Some signed it who afterwards proved false to him, among them Field Marshal Piccolomini, who afterwards betrayed him. Just what designs that dark and much revolving man contemplated, it is not easy to tell. It may have been treachery to the Emperor, but he was not the man to freely reveal his secrets. The one person he trusted was Piccolomini, whose star seemed in favourable conjunction with his own. To him he made known some of his projected movements, only to find in the end that his trusted confidant had revealed them all to the Emperor. The plot against Wallenstein was now put into effect, the Emperor ordering his deposition from his command and appointing General Gablas to replace him, while a general amnesty for all his officers was announced. Wallenstein was quickly taught how little he could trust his troops and officers. Many of his generals fell from him at once. A few regiments only remained faithful, and even in their ranks traitors lurked. With but 1,000 men to follow him, he proceeded to Eger, and from there asked aid of Bernhard of Weimar, as if he purposed to join with those against whom he had so long fought. Bernhard received the message with deep astonishment, and exclaimed, moved by his belief that Wallenstein was in league with the devil, "He who does not trust in God can never be trusted by man." The great soldier of fortune was near his end. The stars were powerless to save him. It was not enough to deprive him of his command. His enemies did not deem it safe to let him live. One army gone, his wealth and his fame might soon bring him another, made up of those mercenary soldiers of all nations and of all or no creeds, who would follow Satan if he promised them plunder. His death had been resolved upon, and the agent chosen for its execution was Colonel Butler, one of the officers who had accompanied him to Eger. It was late in February, 1634. On the night fixed for the murder, Wallenstein's faithful friends, Illo, Terzka, Kinsky, and Captain Neumann, were at a banquet in the castle of Eger. The agents of death were Colonel Butler, an Irish officer named Leslie, and a Scotchman named Gordon, while the soldiers employed were a number of dragoons, chiefly Irish. In the midst of the dinner, the doors of the banqueting hall were burst open, and the assassins rushed upon their victims, killing them as they sat, with the exception of Terzka, who killed 2 of his assailants before he was dispatched. From this scene of murder the assassins rushed to the quarters of Wallenstein. It was midnight, and he had gone to bed. He sprang up as his door was burst open, and Captain Devereux, one of the party, rushed with drawn sword into the room. "Are you the villain who would sell the army to the enemy and tear the crown from the Emperor's head?" he shouted. Wallenstein's only answer was to open his arms, and receive the blow aimed at his breast. He died without a word. Thus, with a brief interval between, had fallen military genius and burning ambition in 2 forms, that of the heroic Swede and that of the ruthless Bohemian. End of Chapter 26. Chapter 27 of Historical Tales, Volume 5, German. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Historical Tales, Volume 5, German, by Charles Morris. Chapter 27, The Siege of Vienna. Once more the Grand Turk was afoot. Straight on Vienna he had marched, with an army of more than 200,000 men. At length he had reached the goal for which he had so often aimed, the Austrian capital, while all Western Europe was threatened by his arms. The Grand Vizier, Kara Mustafa, headed the army, which had marched straight through Hungary without wasting time in petty sieges, and hastened towards the imperial city with scarce a barrier in its path. Consternation filled the Viennese as the vast army of the Turks rolled steadily nearer and nearer, pillaging the country as it came, and moving onward as irresistibly and almost as destructively as a lava flow. The Emperor and his court fled in terror. Many of the wealthy inhabitants followed, bearing with them such treasures as they could convey. The land lay helpless under the shadow of terror which the coming host threw far before its columns. But pillage takes time. The Turks, through the greatness of their numbers, moved slowly. Some time was left for action. The inhabitants of the city, taking courage, armed for defence. The Duke of Lorraine, whose small army had not ventured to face the foe, left 12,000 men in the city, and drew back with the remainder to wait for reinforcements. Count Rödiger of Staremberg was left in command, and made all haste to put the imperilled city in a condition of defence. On came the Turks, the smoke of burning villages the signal of their approach. On the 14th of June, 1863, their mighty army appeared before the walls, and a city of tents was built that covered a space of 6 leagues in extent. Their camp was arranged in the form of a crescent, enclosing within its boundaries a promiscuous mass of soldiers and camp followers, camels and baggage waggons, which seemed to extend as far as the eye could reach. In the centre was the gorgeous tent of the Vizier, made of green silk and splendid with its embroidery of gold, silver, and precious stones, while inside it was kept the holy standard of the Prophet. Marvellous stories are told of the fountains, baths, gardens, and other appliances of Oriental luxury with which the Vizier surrounded himself in this magnificent tent. 2 days after the arrival of the Turkish host, the trenches were opened, the cannon placed, and the siege of Vienna began. For more than 2 centuries the conquerors of Constantinople had kept their eyes fixed on this city as a glorious prize. Now they had reached it, and the thunder of their cannon around its walls was full of threat for the West. Vienna once theirs, it was not easy to say where their career of conquest would be stayed. Fortunately, Count Rödiger was an able and vigilant soldier, and defended the city with a skill and obstinacy that baffled every effort of his foes. The Turks, determined on victory, thundered upon the walls till they were in many parts reduced to heaps of ruins. With incessant labour they undermined them, blew up the strongest bastions, and laid their plans to rush into the devoted city, from which they hoped to gain a glorious booty. But active as they were, the besieged were no less so. The damage done by day was repaired by night, and still Vienna turned a heroic face to its thronging enemies. Furious assaults were made, multitudes of the Turks rushing with savage cries to the breaches, only to be hurled back by the obstinate valour of the besieged. Every foot of ground was fiercely contested, the struggle at each point being desperate and determined. It was particularly so around the Löbel bastion, where scarcely an inch of ground was left unstained by the blood of the struggling foes. Count Rödiger, although severely wounded, did not let his hurt reduce his vigilance. Daily he had himself carried round the circle of the works, directing and cheering his men. Bishop Kolonich attended the wounded, and with such active and useful zeal that the Grand Vizier sent him a threat that he would have his head for his meddling. Despite this fulmination of fury, the worthy bishop continued to use his threatened head in the service of mercy and sympathy. But the numbers of the garrison grew rapidly less, and their incessant duty wore them out with fatigue. The commandant was forced to threaten death to any sentinel found asleep upon his post. A fire broke out, which was only suppressed with the greatest exertion. Famine also began to invade the city, and the condition of the besieged grew daily more desperate. Their only hope lay in relief from without, and this did not come. 2 months passed slowly by. The Turks had made a desert of the surrounding country, and held many thousands of its inhabitants as prisoners in their camp. Step by step they gained upon the defenders. By the end of August they possessed the moat around the city walls. On the 4th of September a mine was sprung under the Burg bastion, with such force that it shook half the city like an earthquake. The bastion was rent and shattered for a width of more than 30 feet, portions of its walls being hurled far and wide. Into the great breach made, the assailants poured in an eager multitude, but the defenders were equally alert and drove them back with loss. On the following day they charged again, and were again repulsed by the brave Viennese, the ruined bastion becoming a very gulf of death. The Turks, finding their efforts useless, resumed the work of mining, directing their efforts against the same bastion. On the 10th of September the new mine was sprung, and this time with such effect that a breach was made through which a whole Turkish battalion was able to force its way. The city now was in the last extremity of danger. Unless immediate relief came, all would soon be lost. The garrison had been much reduced by sickness and wounds, while those remaining were so completely exhausted as to be almost incapable of defence. Rödiger had sent courier after courier to the Duke of Lorraine in vain. In vain the lookouts swept the surrounding country with their eyes in search of some trace of coming aid. All seemed at an end. During the night a circle of rockets was fired from the tower of St. Stephen's as a signal of distress. This done, the wretched Viennese waited for the coming day, almost hopeless of repelling the hosts which threatened to engulf them. At the utmost, a few days must end the siege. A single day might do it. That dreadful night of suspense passed away. With the dawn the wearied garrison was alert, prepared to strike a last blow for safety and defence, and to guard the yawning breach unto death. They waited with the courage of despair for an assault which did not come. Hurried and excited movements were visible in the enemy's camp. Could succour be at hand? Yes! From the summit of the Kalen hill came the distant report of 3 cannon, a signal that filled the souls of the garrison with joy. Quickly afterwards the lookouts discerned the glitter of weapons and the waving of Christian banners on the hill. The rescuers were at hand, and barely in time to save the city from its almost triumphant foes. During the siege the Christian people outside had not been idle. Bavaria, Saxony, and the lesser provinces of the empire mustered their forces in all haste, and sent them to the reinforcement of Charles of Lorraine. To their aid came Sobieski, the chivalrous king of Poland, with 18,000 picked men at his back. He himself was looked upon as a more valuable reinforcement than his whole army. He had already distinguished himself against the Turks, who feared and hated him, while all Europe looked to him as its saviour from the infidel foe. There were in all about 77,000 men in the army whose vanguard ascended the Kalen hill on that critical 11th of September, and announced its coming to the beleaguered citizens by its 3 signal shots. The Turks, too confident in their strength, had thoughtlessly failed to occupy the heights, and by this carelessness gave their foes a position of vantage. In truth, the Vizier, proud in his numbers, viewed the coming foe with disdain, and continued to pour a shower of bombs and balls upon the city, while despatching what he deemed would be a sufficient force to repel the enemy. On the morning of September 12th, Sobieski led his troops down the hill, to encounter the dense masses of the Moslems in the plain below. This celebrated chief headed his men with his head partly shaved, in the Polish fashion, and plainly dressed, though he was attended by a brilliant retinue. In front went an attendant bearing the king's arms emblazoned. Beside him was another who carried a plume on the point of his lance. On his left rode his son James, on his right Charles of Lorraine. Before the battle he knighted his son, and made a stirring address to his troops, in which he told them that they fought not for Vienna alone, but for all Christendom, not for an earthly sovereign, but for the King of Kings. Early in the day the left wing of the army had attacked and carried the village of Nussdorf on the Danube, driving out its Turkish defenders after an obstinate resistance. It was about midday when the King of Poland led the right wing into the plain against the dense battalions of Turkish horsemen which there awaited his assault. The ringing shouts of his men told the enemy that it was the dreaded Sobieski whom they had to meet, their triumphant foe on many a well-fought field. At the head of the cavalry he dashed upon their crowded ranks with such impetuosity as to penetrate to their very centre, carrying before him confusion and dismay. So daring was his assault that he soon found himself in imminent danger, having ridden considerably in advance of his men. Only a few companions were with him, while around him crowded the dense columns of the foe. In a few minutes more he would have been overpowered and destroyed, had not the German cavalry perceived his peril and come at full gallop to his rescue, scattering with the vigour of their charge the turbaned assailants, and snatching him from the very hands of death. So sudden and fierce was the assault, so poorly led the Turkish horsemen, and so alarming to them were the war cry of Sobieski's men, that in a short time they were completely overthrown, and were soon in flight in all directions. This, however, was but a partial success. The main body of the Turkish army had taken no part. Their immense camp, with its thousands of tents, maintained its position, and the batteries continued to bombard the city as if in disdain of the paltry efforts of their foes. Yet it seems to have been rather rage and alarm than disdain that animated the Vizier. He is said to have, in a paroxysm of fury, turned the scimitars of his followers upon the prisoners in his camp, slaughtering 30,000 of these unfortunates, while bidding his cannoneers to keep up their assault upon the city. These evidences of indecision and alarm in their leader filled the Turks with dread. They saw their cavalry battalions flying in confusion, heard the triumphant trumpets of their foes, learned that the dreaded Polish king was at the head of the irresistible charging columns, and yet beheld their commander pressing the siege as if no foe were in the field. It was evident that the Vizier had lost his head through fright. A sudden terror filled their souls. They broke and fled. While Sobieski and the other leaders were in council to decide whether the battle should be continued that evening or left till the next morning, word was brought them that the enemy was in full flight, running away in every direction. They hastened out. The tidings proved true. A panic had seized the Turks, and abandoning tents, cannon, baggage, everything, they were flying in wild haste from the beleaguered walls. The alarm quickly spread through their ranks. Those who had been firing on the city left their guns and joined in the flight. From rank to rank, from division to division, it extended, until the whole army had decamped, and was hastening in panic terror over the plain, hotly pursued by the death-dealing columns of the Christian cavalry, and thinking only of Constantinople and safety. The booty found in the camp was immense. The tent of the Grand Vizier alone was valued at nearly $500,000, and the whole spoil was estimated as worth $15,000,000. The king wrote to his wife as follows: "The whole of the enemy's camp, together with their artillery and an incalculable amount of property, has fallen into our hands. The camels and mules, together with the captive Turks, are driven away in herds, while I myself am become the heir of the Grand Vizier. The banner which was usually borne before him, together with the standard of Mohammed, with which the Sultan had honoured him in this campaign, and the tents, waggons, and baggage, are all fallen to my share. Even some of the quivers, captured among the rest, are alone worth several $1,000s. It would take too long to describe all the other objects of luxury found in his tents, as for instance his baths, fountains, gardens, and a variety of rare animals. This morning I was in the city, and found that it could hardly have held out more than 5 days. Never before did the eye of man see a work of equal magnitude despatched with a vigour like that with which they blew up and shattered to pieces huge masses of stone and rocks." Sobieski, on entering Vienna, was greeted with the warmest gratitude and enthusiasm by crowds of people, who looked upon him as their deliverer. The governor, Count Roediger, grasped his hand with affection, the populace followed him in his every movement, while cries of "Long live the king!" everywhere resounded. Never had been a more signal delivery, and the citizens were beside themselves with joy. In this siege the Turks had lost 48,000 men. 20,000 more fell on the day of battle, and an equal number during the retreat. It is said that in the tent of the Grand Vizier were found letters from Louis XIV containing the full plan of the siege, and to the many crimes of ambition of this monarch seems to be added that of bringing this frightful peril upon Europe for his own selfish ends. As for the unlucky Vizier, he was put to death by strangling, by order of the angry Sultan, on his reaching Belgrade. It is said that his head, found on the taking of Belgrade by Eugene years afterwards, was sent to Bishop Kolonich, whose own head the Vizier had threatened to take, in revenge for his labours among the wounded of Vienna. The war with the Turks continued, with some few intermissions, for 15 years afterwards. It ended to the great advantage of the Christian armies. One after another the fortresses of Hungary were wrested from their hands, and in the year 1687 they were totally defeated at Mohacs by the Duke of Lorraine and Prince Eugene, and the whole of Hungary torn from their grasp. In 1697 another great victory over them was won by Eugene at Senta, by which the power of the Turks was completely broken. Belgrade, which they had long held, fell into his hands, and a peace was signed which confirmed Austria in the possession of all Hungary. From that time forward the terror which the Turkish name had so long inspired vanished, and the siege of Vienna may be looked upon as the concluding act in the long array of invasions of Europe by the Mongolian hordes of Asia. It was to be followed by the gradual recovery, now almost consummated, of their European dominions from their hands. End of chapter 27. Chapter 28 of Historical Tales, Volume 5, German. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Historical Tales, Volume 5, German. By Charles Morris. Chapter 28. The Youth of Frederick the Great. An extraordinarily rude, coarse, and fierce old despot was Frederick William, first King of Prussia, son of the great Elector, and father of Frederick the Great. He hated France and the French language and culture, then so much in vogue in Europe. He despised learning and science. Ostentation was to him a thing unknown, and he had but two passions, one being to possess the tallest soldiers in Europe, the other to have his own fierce will in all things on which he set his mind. About all that we can say in his favour is that he paid much attention to the promotion of education in his realm, many schools being opened and compulsory attendance enforced. Of the fear with which he inspired many of his subjects, and the methods he took to overcome it, there is no better example than that told in relation to a Jew whom the king saw as he was riding one day through Berlin. The poor Israelite was slinking away in dread when the king rode up, seized him, and asked in harsh tones what ailed him. "Sire, I was afraid of you," said the trembling captive. "Fear me? Fear me, do you?" exclaimed the king in a rage, lashing his riding whip across the man's shoulders with every word. "You dog, I'll teach you to love me." It was in some such fashion that he sought to make his son love him, and with much the same result. In fact, he seemed to entertain a bitter dislike for the beautiful and delicate boy whom fortune had sent him as an heir, and treated him with such brutal severity that the unhappy child grew timid and fearful of his presence. This the harsh old despot ascribed to cowardice, and became more violent accordingly. On one occasion, when young Frederick entered his room, something having happened to excite his rage against him, he seized him by the hair, flung him violently to the floor, and caned him until he had exhausted the strength of his arm on the poor boy's body. His fury growing with the exercise of it, he now dragged the unresisting victim to the windows, seized the curtain cord, and twisted it tightly around his neck. Frederick had barely strength enough to grasp his father's hand and scream for help. The old brute would probably have strangled him had not a chamberlain rushed in and saved him from the madman's hands. The boy, as he grew towards man's estate, developed tastes which added to his father's severity. The French language and literature, which he hated, were the youth's delight, and he took every opportunity to read the works of French authors, and particularly those of Voltaire, who was his favourite among writers. This predilection was not likely to overcome the fierce temper of the king, who discovered his pursuits and flogged him unmercifully, thinking to cane all love for such enervating literature, as he deemed it, out of the boy's mind. In this he failed. Germany in that day had little that deserved the name of literature, and the expanding intellect of the active-minded youth turned irresistibly toward the tabooed works of the French. In truth, he needed some solace for his expanding tastes, for his father's house and habits were far from satisfactory to one with any refinement of nature. The palace of Frederick William was little more attractive than the houses of the humbler citizens of Berlin. The floors were carpetless, the rooms were furnished with common bare tables and wooden chairs. Art was conspicuously absent, luxury wanting, comfort barely considered, even the table was very parsimoniously served. The old king's favourite apartment in all his places of residence was his smoking room, which was furnished with a deal table covered with green baize and surrounded by hard chairs. This was his audience chamber, his hall of state, the room in which the affairs of the kingdom were decided in a cloud of smoke and amid the fumes of beer. Here sat generals in uniform, ministers of state wearing their orders, ambassadors, and noble guests from foreign realms, all smoking short Dutch pipes and breathing the vapours of tobacco. Before each was placed a great mug of beer, and the beer casks were kept freely on tap, for the old despot insisted that all should drink or smoke whether or not they liked beer and tobacco, and he was never more delighted than when he could make a guest drunk or sicken him with the smoke. For food, when they were in need of it, bread and cheese and similar viands might be had. A strange picture of palatial grandeur this. Fortune had missed Frederick William's true vocation in not making him an innkeeper in a German village instead of a king. Around this smoke-shrouded table the most important affairs of state were discussed. Around it the rudest practical jokes were perpetrated. Gundling, a beer-bibbing author whom the king made at once his historian and his butt, was the principal sufferer from these frolics, which displayed abundantly that absence of wit and presence of brutality which is the characteristic of the practical joke. As if in scorn of rank and official dignity, Frederick gave this sot and fool the title of Baron, and created him Chancellor and Chamberlain of the Palace, forcing him always to wear an absurdly gorgeous gala dress, while to show his disdain of learned pursuits, he made him President of his Academy of Sciences, an institution which, in its condition at that time, was suited to the presidency of a Gundling. For these dignities he made the poor butt suffer. On one occasion the kingly joker had a brace of bear cubs laid in Gundling's bed, and the drunken historian tossed in between them, with little heed of the danger to which he exposed the poor victim of his sport. On another occasion, when Gundling grew sullen and refused to leave his room, the king and his boon companions besieged him with rockets and crackers, which they flung in at the open window. A third and more elaborate trick was the following. The king had the door of Gundling's room walled up, so that the drunken dupe wandered the palace halls the whole night long, vainly seeking his vanished door, getting into wrong rooms, disturbing sleepers to ask whither his room had flown, and making the palace almost as uncomfortable for its other inmates as for himself. He ended his journey in the bear's den, where he got a severe hug for his pains. Such were the ideas of royal dignity, of art, science, and learning, and of wit and humour entertained by the first king of Prussia, the coarse-mannered and brutal-minded progenitor of one of the greatest of modern monarchs. His ideas of military power were no wiser or more elevated. His whole soul was set on having a play army, a brigade of tall recruits, whose only merit lay in their inches above the ordinary height of humanity. Much of the revenues of the kingdom were spent upon these giants, whom he had brought from all parts of Europe, by strategy and force where cash and persuasion did not avail. His agents were everywhere on the look-out for men beyond the usual stature, and on more than one occasion blood was shed in the effort to kidnap recruits, while some of his crimps were arrested and executed. More than once Prussia was threatened with war for the practices of its king, yet so eager was he to add to the number of his giants that he let no such difficulties stand in his way. His tall recruits were handsomely paid, and loaded with favours. To one Irishman of extraordinary stature he paid £1,000, while the expense of watching and guarding him while bringing him from Ireland was £200 more. It is said that in all $12,000,000 left the country in payment for these showy and costly giants. By his various processes of force, fraud, and stratagem he collected 3 battalions of tall show soldiers, comprising at one time several thousand men. Not content with the unaided work of nature in providing giants, he attempted to raise a gigantic race in his own dominions, marrying his grenadiers to the tallest women he could find. There is nothing to show that the result of his efforts was successful. The king's giants found life by no means a burden. They enjoyed the highest consideration in Berlin, were loaded with favours, and presented with houses, lands, and other evidences of royal grace, while their only duties were show drills and ostentatious parades. They were too costly and precious to expose to the dangers of actual war. When Frederick William's son came to the throne, the military career of the giants suddenly ended. They were disbanded, pensioned off, or sent to invalid institutions, with secret instructions to the officers that if any of them tried to run away, no hindrance should be placed in their path to freedom. It is, however, with Frederick William's treatment of his son that we are principally concerned. His predilection for the culture and literature of France increased, and under the influence of his favourite associates, 2 young men named Katte and Keith, a degree of licentiousness was developed in his habits. To please his father he accepted a position in the army, but took every opportunity to throw aside the hated uniform, dress in luxurious garments, solace himself with the flute, bury himself among his books, and enjoy the society of the women he admired and the friends he loved. He was frequently forced to attend the king's smoking parties, where he seems to have avoided smoking and drinking as much as possible, escaping from the scene before it degenerated into an orgy of excess, in which it was apt to terminate. These tastes and tendencies were not calculated to increase the love of the brutal old monarch for his son, and the life of the boy became harder to bear as he grew older. His sister Wilhelmina was equally detested by the harsh old king, who treated them both with shameful brutality, knocking them down and using his cane upon them on the slightest provocation, confining them and sending them food unfit to eat, omitting to serve them at table, and using disgusting means to render their food unpalatable. "The king almost starved my brother and me," says the princess. "He performed the office of carver, and helped everybody excepting us 2, and when there happened to be something left in a dish, he would spit upon it to prevent us from eating it. On the other hand, I was treated with abundance of abuse and invectives, being called all day long by all sorts of names, no matter who was present. The king's anger was sometimes so violent that he drove my brother and me away, and forbade us to appear in his presence except at meal-times." This represented the state of affairs when they were almost grown up, and is a remarkable picture of court habits and manners in Germany in the early part of the 18th century. The scene we have already described, in which the king attempted to strangle his son with the curtain cord, occurred when Frederick was in his 19th year, and was one of the acts which gave rise to his resolution to run away, the source of so many sorrows. Poor Frederick's lot had become too hard to bear. He was bent on flight. His mother was the daughter of George I. of England, and he hoped to find at the English court the happiness that failed him at home. He informed his sister of his purpose, saying that he intended to put it into effect during a journey which his father was about to make, and in which opportunities for flight would arise. Kate, he said, was in his interest. Keith would join him. He had made with them all the arrangements for his flight. His sister endeavoured to dissuade him, but in vain. His father's continued brutality, and particularly his use of the cane, had made the poor boy desperate. He wrote to Lieutenant Kate: "I am off, my dear Kate. I have taken such precautions that I have nothing to fear. I shall pass through Leipzig, where I shall assume the name of Marquis d'Ambreville. I have already sent word to Keith, who will proceed direct to England. Lose no time, for I calculate on finding you at Leipzig. Adieu, be of good cheer." The king's journey took place. Frederick accompanied him, his mind full of his projected flight. The king added to his resolution by ill treatment during the journey, and taunted him as he had often done before, saying, "If my father had treated me so, I would soon have run away, but you have no heart, you are a coward." This added to the prince's resolution. He wrote to Kate at Berlin, repeating to him his plans. But now the chapter of accidents, which have spoiled so many well-laid plots, began. In sending this letter he directed it via Nuremberg, but in his haste or agitation forgot to insert Berlin. By ill luck there was a cousin of Kate's of the same name at Erlangen, some 12 miles off. The letter was delivered to and read by him. He saw the importance of its contents, and, moved by an impulse of loyalty, sent it by express to the king at Frankfort. Another accident came from Frederick's friend Keith being appointed lieutenant, his place as page to the prince being taken by his brother, who was as stupid as the elder Keith was acute. The royal party had halted for the night at a village named Steinfurt. This the prince determined to make the scene of his escape, and bade his page to call him at 4 in the morning, and to have horses ready, as he proposed to make an early morning call upon some pretty girls at a neighbouring hamlet. He deemed the boy too stupid to trust with the truth. Young Keith managed to spoil all. Instead of waking the prince, he called his valet, who was really a spy of the king's, and who, suspecting something to be amiss, pretended to fall asleep again, while heedfully watching. Frederick soon after awoke, put on a coat of French cut instead of his uniform, and went out. The valet immediately roused several officers of the king's suite, and told them his suspicions. Much disturbed, they hurried after the prince. After searching through the village, they found him at the horse market, leaning against a cart. His dress added to their suspicions, and they asked him respectfully what he was doing there. He answered sharply, angry at being discovered. "For God's sake, change your coat!" exclaimed Colonel Rochau. "The king is awake, and will start in half an hour. What would be the consequence if he were to see you in this dress?" "I promise you that I will be ready before the king," said Frederick. "I only mean to take a little turn." While they were arguing, the page arrived with the horses. The prince seized the bridle of one of them, and would have leaped upon it but for the interference of those around him, who forced him to return to the barn, in which the royal party had found its only accommodation for that night. Here he was obliged to put on his uniform, and to restrain his anger. During the day the valet and others informed the king of what had occurred. He said nothing, as there were no proofs of the prince's purpose. That night they reached Frankfort. Here the king received, the next morning, the letter sent him by Kate's cousin. He showed it to two of his offers, and bade them on peril of their heads to keep a close watch on the prince, and to take him immediately to the yacht on which the party proposed to travel the next day by water to Wesel. The king embarked the next morning, and as soon as he saw the prince his smothered rage burst into fury. He grasped him violently by the collar, tore his hair out by the roots, and struck him in the face with the knob of his stick till the blood ran. Only by the interference of the two officers was the unhappy youth saved from more extreme violence. His sword was taken from him, his effects were seized by the king, and his papers burned by his valet before his face, in which he did all concerned an important service. At the request of his keepers the prince was taken to another yacht. On reaching the bridge of boats at the entrance to Wesel, he begged permission to land there, so that he might not be known. His keepers acceded, but he was no sooner on land than he ran off at full speed. He was stopped by a guard whom the king had sent to meet him, and was conducted to the town house. Not a word was said to the king about this attempt at flight. The next day Frederick was brought before his father, who was in a raging passion. "Why did you try to run away?" he furiously asked. "Because," said Frederick firmly, "you have not treated me like your son, but like a base slave. You are an infamous deserter, and have no honour." "I have as much as you," retorted the prince. "I have done no more than I have heard you say 100 times that you would do if you were in my place." This answer so incensed the old tyrant that he drew his sword in fury from its scabbard and would have run the boy through, had not General Mosul hastily stepped between and seized the king's arm. "If you must have blood, stab me," he said. "My old carcass is not good for much, but spare your son." These words checked the king's brutal fury. He ordered them to take the boy away, and listened with more composure to the general, who entreated him not to condemn the prince without a hearing, and not to commit the unpardonable crime of being his son's executioner. Events followed rapidly upon this discovery. Frederick contrived to despatch a line in pencil to Keith. "Save yourself," he wrote. "All is discovered." Keith at once fled, reached the Hague, where he was concealed in the house of Lord Chesterfield, the English ambassador, and when searched for there, succeeded in escaping to England in a fishing boat. He was hung in effigy in Prussia, but became a major of cavalry in the service of Portugal. Kata was less fortunate. He was warned in time to escape, and the marshal who was sent to arrest him purposely delayed, but he lost precious time in preparation, and was seized while mounting his horse. His arrest filled the queen with terror. Numerous letters were in his possession, which had been written by herself and her daughter to the Prince Royal. In these they had often spoken with great freedom of the king. It might be ruinous, should these letters fall into his hands. Some friend sent the portfolio supposed to contain them to the queen. It was locked, corded, and sealed. The trouble about the seal was overcome by an old valet, who had found in the palace garden one just like it. The portfolio was opened, and the queen's fears found to be correct. It contained the letters, not less than 1,500 in all. They were all hastily thrown into the fire. Too hastily, for many of them were innocent of offence. But it would not do to return an empty portfolio. The queen and her daughter immediately began to write letters to replace the burned ones, taking paper of each year's manufacture to prevent discovery. For 3 days they diligently composed and wrote, and in that period fabricated no less than 600 or 700 letters. These far from filled the portfolio, but the queen packed other things into it, and then locked and sealed it, so that no change in its appearance could be perceived. This done, it was restored to its place. We must hasten over what followed. On the king's return, his first greeting to his wife was, "Your good-for-nothing son is dead." He immediately demanded the portfolio, tore it open, and carried away the letters which had been so recently concocted. In a few minutes he returned, and on seeing his daughter broke out into a fury of rage, his eyes glaring, his mouth foaming. "Infamous wretch!" he shouted. "Dare you appear in my presence? Go keep your scoundrel of a brother company." He seized her as he spoke, and struck her several times violently in the face, one blow on the temple hurling her to the floor. Mad with rage, he would have trampled on her, had not the ladies present got her away. The scene was a frightful one. The queen, believing her son dead, and completely unnerved, ran wildly around the room shrieking with agony. The king's face was so distorted with rage as to be frightful to look at. His younger children were around his knees, begging him with tears to spare their sister. Wilhelmina, her face bruised and swollen, was supported by one of the ladies of the court. Rarely had insane rage created a more distressing spectacle. In the end the king acknowledged that Frederick was still alive, but vowed that he would have his head off as a deserter, and that Wilhelmina, his confederate, should be imprisoned for life. He left the room at length to question Kate, who was being brought before him, harshly exclaiming as he did so, "Now I shall have evidence to convict the scoundrel Fritz and that blackguard Wilhelmina. I shall find plenty of reasons to have their heads off." But we must hasten to the conclusion. Both the captives were tried by court-martial on the dangerous charge of desertion from the army. The court which tried Frederick proved to be subservient to the king's will. They pronounced sentence of death on the Prince Royal. Kate was sentenced to imprisonment for life, on the plea that his crime had only been meditated, not committed. The latter sentence did not please the despot. He changed it himself from life imprisonment to death, and with a refinement of cruelty ordered the execution to take place under the prince's window and within his sight. On the 5th of November, 1730, Frederick, wearing a coarse prison dress, was conducted from his cell in the fortress of Küstrin to a room on the lower floor, where the window curtains, let down as he entered, were suddenly drawn up. He saw before him a scaffold hung with black, which he believed to be intended for himself, and gazed upon it with shuddering apprehension. When informed that it was intended for his friend, his grief and pain became even more acute. He passed the night in that room, and the next morning was conducted again to the window, beneath which he saw his condemned friend, accompanied by soldiers, an officer, and a minister of religion. "Oh," cried the prince, "how miserable it makes me to think that I am the cause of your death! Would to God I were in your place!" "No," replied Kata, "if I had 1,000 lives, gladly would I lay them down for you." Frederick swooned as his friend moved on. In a few minutes afterwards Kata was dead. It was long before the sorrowing prince recovered from the shock of that cruel spectacle. Whether the king actually intended the execution of his son is questioned. As it was, earnest remonstrances were addressed to him from the kings of Sweden and Poland, the Emperor of Germany, and other monarchs. He gradually recovered from the insanity of his rage, and on humble appeals from his son, remitted his sentence, requiring him to take a solemn oath that he was converted from his infidel beliefs, that he begged 1,000 pardons from his father for his crimes, and that he repented not having been always obedient to his father's will. This done, Frederick was released from prison, but was kept under surveillance at Küstrin till February 1732, when he was permitted to return to Berlin. He had been there before on the occasion of his sister's marriage, in November 1731, the poor girl gladly accepting marriage to a prince she had never seen as a means of escape from a king of whom she had seen too much. With this our story ends. Father and son were reconciled, and lived, to all appearance, as good friends until 1740, when the old despot died, and Frederick succeeded him as king. End of Chapter 28. Chapter 29 of Historical Tales, Volume 5, German. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Historical Tales, Volume 5, German, by Charles Morris. Chapter 29. Voltaire and Frederick the Great. Voltaire, who was an adept in the art of making France too hot to hold him, had gone to Prussia as a place of rest for his perturbed spirit, and in response to the repeated invitations of his ardent admirer, Frederick the Great. It was a blunder on both sides. If they had wished to continue friends, they should have kept apart. Frederick was autocratic in his ways and thoughts. Voltaire embodied the spirit of independence in thought and speech. The two men could no more meet without striking fire than flint and steel. Moreover, Voltaire was normally satirical, restless, inclined to vanity and jealousy, and that terrible pen of his could never be brought to respect persons and places. With a martinet like Frederick, the visit was sure to end in a quarrel, despite the admiration of the prince for the poet. Frederick, though a German king, was French in his love for the Gallic literature, philosophy, and language. He cared little for German literature. There was little of it in his day worth caring for, and always wrote and spoke in French, while French wits and thinkers, who could not live in safety in strait-laced Paris, gained the amplest scope for their views in his court. Voltaire found 3 such immigrants there, Maupertuis, La Mettrie, and Darnaud. He was received by them with enthusiasm, as the sovereign of their little court of free thought. Frederick had given him a pension and the post of chamberlain, an office with very light duties, and the expatriated poet set himself out to enjoy his new life with zest and animation. 150,000 victorious soldiers, he wrote to Paris, no attorneys, opera, plays, philosophy, poetry, a hero who was a philosopher and a poet, grandeur and graces, grenadiers and muses, trumpets and violins, Plato's symposium, society, and freedom. Who would believe it? It is all true, however. It is Caesar, it is Marcus Aurelius, it is Julian, it is sometimes Abbé Chaulieu, with whom I sup, he further wrote. There is the charm of retirement, there is the freedom of the country, with all those little delights which the lord of a castle, who is a king, can procure for his very obedient, humble servants and guests. My own duties are to do nothing. I enjoy my leisure. I give an hour a day to the King of Prussia to touch up a bit his works in prose and verse. I am his grammarian, not his chamberlain. Never in any place in the world was there more freedom of speech touching the superstitions of men, and never were they treated with more banter and contempt. God is respected, but all they who have cajoled men in his name are treated unsparingly. It was, in short, an Eden for a free-thinker, but an Eden with its serpent, and this serpent was the envy, jealousy, and unrestrainable satiric spirit of Voltaire. There was soon trouble between him and his fellow exiles. He managed to get Arnauld exiled from the country, and gradually a coolness arose between him and Maupertuis, whom Frederick had made president of the Berlin Academy. There were other quarrels and complications, and Voltaire grew disgusted with the occupation of what he slyly called buck-washing, the king's French verses, poor affairs they were. Step by step he was making Berlin as hot as he had made Paris. The new Adam was growing restless in his new paradise. He wrote to his niece: "So it is known by this time in Paris, my dear child, that we have played the Mort de César at Potsdam, that Prince Henry is a good actor, has no accent, and is very amiable, and that this is the place for pleasure. All this is true, but the king's supper parties are delightful; at them people talk reason, wit, and science. Freedom prevails thereat; he is the soul of it all. No ill temper, no clouds, at any rate no storms. My life is free and well occupied. But opera, plays, carousals, suppers at Sans Souci, military manoeuvres, concerts, studies, readings. But the city of Berlin, grand, better laid out than Paris. Palaces, playhouses, affable queens, charming princesses, maids of honor, beautiful and well made, the mansion of Madame de Tyrconnel, always full and sometimes too much so. But, my dear child, the weather is beginning to settle down into a fine frost." Voltaire brought the frost. He got into a disreputable quarrel with a Jew, and meddled in other affairs, until something very like a quarrel arose between him and Frederick. The king wrote him a severe letter of reprimand. The poet apologized. But immediately afterward his irrepressible spirit of mischief broke out in a new place. It was his ill humour with Maupertuis which now led him astray. He wrote a pamphlet, full of wit and as full of bitterness, called La Diatribe du Docteur Akakia, so evidently satirizing Maupertuis that the king grew furious. It was printed anonymously and circulated surreptitiously in Berlin, but a copy soon fell into Frederick's hand, who knew at once that but one man in the kingdom was capable of such a production. He wrote so severely to Voltaire that the malicious satirist was frightened, and gave up the whole edition of the pamphlet, which was burnt before his eyes in the king's own closet, though Frederick could not help laughing at its wit. But Voltaire's daring was equal to a greater defiance than Frederick imagined. Despite the work of the flames, a copy of the diatribe found its way to Paris, was printed there, and copies of it made their way back to Prussia by mail. Everybody was reading it, everybody laughing, people fought for copies of the satire, which spread over Europe. The king, enraged by this treacherous disobedience, as he deemed it, retorted on Voltaire by having the pamphlet burned in the Place d'Armes. This brought matters to a crisis. The next day Voltaire sent his commissions and orders back to Frederick. The next, Frederick returned them to him. He was bent on leaving Prussia at once, but wished to do it without a quarrel with the king. "I sent the Solomon of the North," he wrote to Madame Denis, "for his present, the cap and bells he gave me, with which you reproached me so much. I wrote him a very respectful letter, for I asked him for leave to go. What do you think he did? He sent me his great factotum Federshoff, who brought me back my toys. He wrote me a letter saying that he would rather have me to live with than Maupertuis. What is quite certain is that I would rather not live with either the one or the other." In truth, Frederick could not bear to lose Voltaire. Vexed as he was with them, he was averse to giving up that charming conversation from which he had derived so much enjoyment. Voltaire wanted to get away, Frederick pressed him to stay. There was protestation, warmth, coolness, a gradual breaking of links, letters from France urging the poet to return, communications from Frederick wishing him to remain, and a growing attraction from Paris, drawing its flown sun back to that centre of the universe for a true Frenchman. At length Frederick yielded, Voltaire might go. The poet approached him while reviewing his troops. "Ah, Monsieur Voltaire," said the king, "so you really intend to go away?" "Sir, urgent private affairs, and especially my health, leave me no alternative. Monsieur, I wish you a pleasant journey." This was enough for Voltaire. In an hour he was in his carriage and on the road to Leipzig. He thought that he was done for the rest of his life with the exactions and tyrannies of the King of Prussia. He was to experience some more of them before he left the land. Frederick bided his time. It was on March 26, 1753, that Voltaire left Potsdam. It was 2 months afterwards before he reached Frankfort. He had tarried at Leipzig and at Gotha, engaged in the latter place on a dry chronicle asked for by the Duchess, entitled The Annals of the Empire. During this time also, in direct disregard of a promise he had made Frederick, there appeared a supplement to Doctor Akakia, more offensive than the main text. It was followed by a virulent correspondence with Maupertuis. Voltaire was filling up the vials of wrath of the king. On May 31st he reached Frankfort. Here the blow fell. There occurred an incident which has become famous in literary history, and which, while it had some warrant on Frederick's side, tells very poorly for that patron of literature. No unlettered autocrat could have acted with less regard to the rights and proprieties of citizenship. "Here is how this fine adventure came about," writes Voltaire. "There was at Frankfort one Freytag, who had been banished from Dresden, and had become an agent for the King of Prussia. He notified me on behalf of his Majesty that I was not to leave Frankfort till I had restored the valuable effects I was carrying away from his Majesty. Alack, sir, I am carrying nothing away from that country, if you please, not even the smallest regret. What, pray, are those jewels of the Brandenburg crown that you require?" "It be, sir," replied Freytag, "the work of poesy of the king, my gracious master." "Oh, I will give him back his prose and verse with all my heart," replied I, "though, after all, I have more than one right to the work. He made me a present of a beautiful copy printed at his expense. Unfortunately, the copy is at Leipzig with my other luggage." Then Freytag proposed to me to remain at Frankfort until the treasure which was at Leipzig should have arrived, and he signed an order for it. The volume which Frederick wanted he had doubtless good reason to demand, when it is considered that it was in the hands of a man who could be as malicious as Voltaire. It contained a burlesque and licentious poem called the Palladium, in which the king scoffed at everybody and everything in a manner he preferred not to make public. Voltaire in Berlin might be trusted to remain discreet. In Paris his discretion could not be counted on. Frederick wanted the poem in his own hands. There was delay in the matter, references to Frederick and returns; the affair dragged on slowly. The package arrived. Voltaire, agitated at his detention, ill and anxious, wanted to get away, in company with Madame Denis, who had just joined him. Freytag refused to let him go. Very unwisely, the poet determined to slip away, imagining that in a free city like Frankfort he could not be disturbed. He was mistaken. The freedom of Frankfort was subject to the will of Frederick. The poet tells for himself what followed. "The moment I was off, I was arrested, I, my secretary, and my people. My niece is arrested. 4 soldiers drag her through the mud to a cheesemonger's named Smith, who had some title or other of privy councillor to the King of Prussia. My niece had a passport from the King of France, and, what is more, she had never corrected the King of Prussia's verses. They huddled us all into a sort of hostelry, at the door of which there were posted a dozen soldiers. We were for 12 days prisoners of war, and we had to pay 140 crowns a day." Voltaire was furious. Madame Denis was ill, or feigned to be. She wrote letter after letter to Voltaire's friends in Prussia, and to the king himself. The affair was growing daily more serious. Finally, the city authorities themselves, who doubtless felt that they were not playing a very creditable part, put an end to it by ordering Freytag to release his prisoner. Voltaire, set free, travelled leisurely towards France, which, however, he found himself refused permission to enter. He thereupon repaired to Geneva, and thereafter, freed from the patronage of princes and the injustice of the powerful, spent his life in a land where full freedom of thought and action were possible. As for the worthy Freytag, he felicitated himself highly on the way he had handled that dabbler in poesy. "We would have risked our lives rather than let him get away," he wrote, "and if I, holding a council of war with myself, had not found him at the barrier but in the open country, and he had refused to jog back, I don't know that I shouldn't have lodged a bullet in his head. To such a degree had I at heart the letters and writing of the king." The too trusty agent did not feel so self-satisfied on receiving the opinion of the king. "I gave you no such orders as that," wrote Frederick. "You should never make more noise than a thing deserves. I wanted Voltaire to give you up the key, the cross, and the volume of poems I had entrusted to him. As soon as all that was given up to you, I can't see what earthly reason could have induced you to make this uproar." It is very probable, however, that Frederick wished to humiliate Voltaire, and the latter did not fail to revenge himself with that weapon which he knew so well how to yield. In his poem La Loi Naturelle he drew a bitter but truthful portrait of Frederick, which must have made that arbitrary gentleman wince. He was, says the poet, "of incongruities a monstrous pile, calling men brothers, crushing them the while, with air humane, a misanthropic brute, ofttimes impulsive, sometimes over-cute, weak midst his choler, modest in his pride, yearning for virtue, lust personified, statesman and author of the slippery crew, my patron, pupil, persecutor too." End of chapter 29. Chapter 30 of Historical Tales, Volume 5. 1912. Historical Tales, Volume 5, German, by Charles Morris. Chapter 30. Scenes from the 7 Years' War. The story of Frederick the Great is a story of incessant wars, wars against frightful odds, for all Europe was combined against him, and for 7 years the Austrians, the French, the Russians, and the Swedes surrounded his realm with the bitter determination to crush him, if not to annihilate the Prussian kingdom. England alone was on his side. Russia had joined the coalition through anger of the Empress Elizabeth at Frederick's satire upon her licentious life. France had joined it through hostility to England. Austria had organized it from indignation at Frederick's lawless seizure of Silesia. The army raised to operate against Prussia numbered several 100,000 men. For years Frederick fought them all single-handed, with a persistence, an energy, and a resolute rising under the weight of defeat that compelled the admiration even of his enemies, and in the end gave him victory over them all. To the rigid discipline of his troops, his own military genius, and his indomitable perseverance, he owed his final success and his well-earned epithet of the Great. The story of battle, stirring as it is apt to grow monotonous, and we have perhaps inflicted too many battle scenes already upon our readers, though we have selected only such as had some particular feature of interest to enliven them. Out of Frederick's numerous battles we may be able to present some examples sufficiently diverse from the ordinary to render them worthy of classification under the title of the Romance of History. Let us go back to the 5th of November, 1757. On that date the army of Frederick lay in the vicinity of Rosbach, on the Saale, then occupied by a powerful French army. The Prussian commander, after vainly endeavouring to bring the Austrians to battle, had turned and marched against the French, with the hope of driving them out of Saxony. His hope was not a very promising one. The French army was 60,000 strong; he had but little over 20,000 men. While he felt hope, the French felt assurance. They had their active foe now in their clutches, they deemed. With his handful of men he could not possibly stand before their onset. He had escaped them more than once before. This time they had him, as they believed. His camp was on a height near the Saale. Towards it the French advanced, with flying colours and sounding trumpets, as if with purpose to strike terror into the ranks of their foes. That Frederick would venture to stand before them they scarcely credited. If he should, his danger would be imminent, for they had laid their plans to surround his small force, and by taking the king and his army pensioners, end at a blow the vexatious war. They calculated shrewdly, but not well, for they left Frederick out of the account in their plans. As they came up, line after line, column after column, they must have been surprised by the seeming indifference of the Prussians. They were in their ranks, no signs of retreat and none of hostility. They remained perfectly quiet in their camp, not a gun being fired, not a movement visible, as inert and heedless to all seeming of the coming of the French as though there were no enemy within 100 miles. There was a marked difference between the make-up of the two armies, which greatly reduced their numerical odds. Frederick's army was composed of thoroughly disciplined and trained soldiers, every man of whom knew his place and his duty, and could be trusted in an emergency. The French, on the contrary, had brought all they could of Paris with them. Their army was encumbered with women, wig-makers, barbers, and the like impedimenta, and confusion and gaiety in their ranks replaced the stern discipline of Frederick's camp. After the battle the booty is said to have consisted largely of objects of gallantry better suited for a boudoir than a camp. The light columns of smoke that arose from the Prussian camp as the French advanced indicated their occupation, and that by no means suggested alarm. They were cooking their dinners with as much unconcern as though they had not yet seen the coming enemy, nor heard the clangor of trumpets that announced their approach. Had the French commanders been within the Prussian lines they would have been more astonished still, for they would have seen Frederick with his staff and general officers dining at leisure, and with the utmost coolness and indifference. There was no appearance of haste in their movements, and no more in those of their men, whose whole concern just then seemed to be the getting of a good meal. The hour passed on, the French came nearer, their trumpet clangor was close at hand, every moment seemed to render the peril of the Prussians more imminent, yet their inertness continued. It looked almost as though they had given up the idea of defence. The confidence of the French must have grown rapidly, as their plan of surrounding the Prussians with their superior numbers seemed more and more assured. But Frederick had his eye upon them; he was biding his time. Suddenly there came a change. It was about 2:30 in the afternoon. The French had reached the position for which he had been waiting. Quickly the staff officers dashed right and left with their orders. The trumpets sounded. As if by magic the tents were struck, the men sprang to their ranks and were drawn up in battle array. The artillery opened its fire. The seeming inertness which had prevailed was with extraordinary rapidity exchanged for warlike activity. The complete discipline of the Prussian army had never been more notably displayed. The French, who had been marching forward with careless ease, beheld this change of the situation with astounded eyes. They looked for heaviness and slowness of movement among the Germans, and could scarcely believe in the possibility of such rapidity of evolution. But they had little time to think. The Prussian batteries were pouring a rain of balls through their columns, and quickly the Prussian cavalry, headed by the dashing Seydlitz, was in their midst, cutting and slashing with annihilating vigour. The surprise was complete. The French found it impossible to form into line. Everywhere their columns were being swept by musketry and artillery, and decimated by the sabres of the charging cavalry. In almost less time than it takes to tell it, they were thrown into confusion, overwhelmed, routed. In the course of less than half an hour the fate of the battle was decided, and the French army completely defeated. Their confidence of a short time before was succeeded by panic, and the lately trim ranks fled in utter disorganization, so utterly broken that many of the fugitives never stopped till they reached the other side of the Rhine. 10,000 prisoners fell into Frederick's hands, including 9 generals and numerous other officers, together with all the French artillery and 22 standards, while the victory was achieved with the loss of only 165 killed and 350 wounded on the Prussian side. The triumph was one of discipline against overconfidence. No army under less complete control than that of Frederick could have sprung so suddenly into warlike array. To this, and to the sudden and overwhelming dash of Seydlitz and his cavalry, the remarkable victory was due. Just 1 month from that date, on the 5th of December, another great battle took place, and another important victory for Frederick the Great. With 34,000 Prussians he defeated 80,000 Austrians, while the prisoners taken nearly equalled in number his entire force. The Austrians had taken the opportunity of Frederick's campaign against the French to overrun Silesia. Breslau, its capital, with several other strongholds, fell into their hands, and the probability was that if left there during the winter they would so strongly fortify it as to defy any attempt of the Prussian king to recapture it. Despite the weakness of his army, Frederick decided to make an effort to regain the lost province, and marched at once against the Austrians. They lay in a strong position behind the river Lohe, and here their leader, Field Marshal Daun, wished to have them remain, having had abundant experience of his opponent in the field. This cautious advice was not taken by Prince Charles, who controlled the movements of the army, and whom several of the generals persuaded that it would be degrading for a victorious army to entrench itself against one so much inferior in numbers, and advised him to march out and meet the Prussians. The parade guard of Berlin, as they contemptuously designated Frederick's army, would never be able to make a stand against them. The prince, who was impetuous in disposition, agreed with them, marched out from his entrenchments, and met Frederick's army in the vast plain near Leuthen. On December 5th the two armies came face to face, the lines of the imperial force extending over a space of 5 miles, while those of Frederick occupied a much narrower space. In his lack of numbers the Prussian king was obliged to substitute celerity of movement, hoping to double the effectiveness of his troops by their quickness of action. The story of the battle may be given in a few words. A false attack was made on the Austrian right, and then the bulk of the Prussian army was hurled upon their left wing with such impetuosity as to break and shatter it. The disorder caused by this attack spread until it included the whole army. In 3 hours' time Frederick had completely defeated his foes, 1/3 of whom were killed, wounded, or captured, and the remainder put to flight. The field was covered with the slain, and whole battalions surrendered, the Prussians capturing in all 21,000 prisoners. They took besides 130 cannon and 3,000 baggage and ammunition wagons. The victory was a remarkable example of the supremacy of genius over mere numbers. Napoleon says of it, "That battle was a masterpiece. Of itself it is sufficient to entitle Frederick to a place in the first rank of generals. It restored Silesia to the Prussian dominions." There is one more of Frederick's victories of sufficiently striking character to fit in with those already given. It took place in 1760, several years after those described, years in which Frederick had struggled persistently against overwhelming odds, and though often worsted, yet coming up fresh after every defeat, and unconquerably keeping the field. He was again in Silesia, which was once more seriously threatened by the Austrian forces. His position was anything but a safe one. The Austrians almost surrounded him. On one side was the army of Field Marshal Daun, on the other that of General Laschi. In front was General Loudon. Fighting day and night, he advanced, and finally took up his position at Liegnitz, where he found his forward route blocked, Daun having formed a junction with Loudon. His magazines were at Breslau and Schweidnitz in front, which it was impossible to reach, while his brother, Prince Henry, who might have marched to his relief, was detained by the Russians on the Oder. The position of Frederick was a critical one. He had only a few days' supply of provisions, it was impossible to advance, and dangerous to retreat. The Austrians, in superior numbers, were dangerously near him. Only fortune and valor could save him from serious disaster. In this crisis of his career happy chance came to his aid, and relieved him from the awkward and perilous situation into which he had fallen. The Austrians were keenly on the alert, biding their time and watchful for an opportunity to take the Prussians at advantage. The time had now arrived, as they thought, and they laid their plans accordingly. On the night before the 15th of August, Loudon set out on a secret march, his purpose being to gain the heights of Puffendorf, from which the Prussians might be assailed in the rear. At the same time the other corps were to close in on every side, completely surrounding Frederick and annihilating him if possible. It was a well laid and promising plan, but accident befriended the Prussian king. Accident and alertness, we may say, since to prevent a surprise from the Austrians he was in the habit of changing the location of his camp almost every night. Such a change took place on the night in question. On the 14th the Austrians had made a close reconnaissance of his position. Fearing some hostile purpose in this, Frederick, as soon as the night had fallen, ordered his tents to be struck and the camp to be moved with the utmost silence, so as to avoid giving the foe a hint of his purpose. As it chanced, the new camp was made on those very heights of Puffendorf, towards which Loudon was advancing with equal care and secrecy. That there might be no suspicion of the Prussian movement, the watchfires were kept up in the old camp, peasants attending to them, while patrols of hussars cried out the challenge every quarter of an hour. The gleaming lights, the watch cries of the sentinels, all indicated that the Prussian army was sleeping on its old ground, without suspicion of the overwhelming blow intended for it on the morrow. Meanwhile the king and his army had reached their new quarters, where the utmost caution and noiselessness was observed. The king, wrapped in his military cloak, had fallen asleep beside his watch-fire. Ziethen, his valiant cavalry leader, and a few others of the principal officers, being with him. Throughout the camp the greatest stillness prevailed, all noise having been forbidden. The soldiers slept with their arms close at hand, and ready to be seized at a moment's notice. Frederick fully appreciated the peril of his situation, and was not to be taken by surprise by his active foes. And thus the night moved on until midnight passed, and the new day began its course in the small hours. About 2 o'clock a sudden change came in the situation. A horseman galloped at full speed through the camp, and drew up hastily at the king's tent, calling Frederick from his light slumbers. He was the officer in command of the patrol of hussars, and brought startling news. The enemy was at hand, he said. His advance columns were within a few hundred yards of the camp. It was Loudon's army, seeking to steal into possession of those heights which Frederick had so opportunely occupied. The stirring tidings passed rapidly through the camp. The soldiers were awakened, the officers seized their arms and sprang to horse, the troops grasped their weapons and hastened into line, the cannoneers flew to their guns. Soon the roar of artillery warned the coming Austrians that they had a foe in their front. Loudon pushed on, thinking this to be some advance column which he could easily sweep from his front. Not until day dawned did he discover the true situation, and perceive with astounded eyes that the whole Prussian army stood in line of battle on those very heights which he had hoped so easily to occupy. The advantage on which the Austrian had so fully counted lay with the Prussian king. Yet undaunted, Loudon pushed on and made a vigorous attack, feeling sure that the thunder of the artillery would be borne to Daun's ears, and bring that commander in all haste with his army to take part in the fray. But the good fortune which had so far favoured Frederick did not now desert him. The wind blew freshly in the opposite direction, and carried the sound of the cannon away from Daun's hearing. Not the roar of a piece of artillery came to him, and his army lay moveless during the battle, he deeming that Loudon must now be in full possession of the heights, and felicitating himself on the neat trap into which the King of Prussia had fallen. While he thus rested on his arms, glorying in his soul on the annihilation to which the pestilent Prussians were doomed, his ally was making a desperate struggle for life on those very heights which he counted on taking without a shot. Truly, the Austrians had reckoned without their foe in laying their cunning plot. 3 hours of daylight finished the affray. Taken by surprise as they were, the Austrians proved unable to sustain the vigorous Prussian assault, and were utterly routed, leaving 10,000 dead and wounded on the field, and 82 pieces of artillery in the enemy's hands. Shortly afterwards, Daun, advancing to carry out his share of the scheme of annihilation, fell upon the right wing of the Prussians, commanded by General Ziethen, and was met with so fierce an artillery fire that he halted in dismay. And now news of Loudoun's disaster was brought to him. Seeing that the game was lost, and himself in danger, he emulated his associate in his hasty retreat. Fortune and alertness had saved the Prussian king from a serious danger, and turned peril into victory. He lost no time in profiting by his advantage, and was in full march towards Breslau within 3 hours after the battle, the prisoners in the centre, the wounded, friend and foe alike, in wagons in the rear, and the captured cannon added to his own artillery train. Silesia was once more delivered into his hands. Never in history had there been so persistent and indomitable a resistance against overwhelming numbers as that which Frederick sustained for so many years against his numerous foes. At length, when hope seemed almost at an end, and it appeared as if nothing could save the Prussian kingdom from overthrow, death came to the aid of the courageous monarch. The Empress Elizabeth of Russia died, and Frederick's bitterest foe was removed. The new monarch, Peter III., was an ardent admirer of Frederick, and at once discharged all the Prussian prisoners in his hands, and signed a treaty of alliance with Prussia. Sweden quickly did the same, leaving Frederick with no opponents but the Austrians. 4 months more sufficed to bring his remaining foes to terms, and by the end of the year 1762 the distracting 7 Years' War was at an end, the indomitable Frederick remaining in full possession of Silesia, the great bone of contention in the war. His resolution and perseverance had raised Prussia to a high position among the kingdoms of Europe, and laid the foundations of the present empire of Germany. End of Chapter 30. Chapter 31 of Historical Tales, Volume 5, German. This LibriVox is in the public domain. Historical Tales, Volume 5, German, by Charles Morris. Chapter 31 The Patriots of the Tyrol. On the 9th of April, 1809, down the river Inn, in the Tyrol, came floating a series of planks, from whose surface waved little red flags. What they meant, the Bavarian soldiers, who held that mountain land with a hand of iron, could not conjecture. But what they meant the peasantry well knew. On the day before, peace had ruled throughout the Alps, and no Bavarian dreamed of war. Those flags were the signal for insurrection, and on their appearance the brave mountaineers sprang at once to arms, and flew to the defence of the bridges of their country, which the Bavarians were marching to destroy, as an act of defence against the Austrians. On the 10th the storm of war burst. Some Bavarian sappers had been sent to blow up the bridge of St. Lorenzo, but hardly had they begun their work when a shower of bullets from unseen marksmen swept the bridge. Several were killed, the rest took flight. The Tyrol was in revolt. News of this outbreak was borne to Colonel Wrede, in command of the Bavarians, who hastened with a force of infantry, cavalry, and artillery to the spot. He found the peasants out in numbers. The Tyrolean riflemen, who were accustomed to bring down chamois from the mountain peaks, defended the bridge and made terrible havoc in the Bavarian ranks. They seized Wrede's artillery and flung guns and gunners together into the stream, and finally put the Bavarians to rout with severe loss. The Bavarians held the Tyrol as allies of the French, and the movement against the bridges had been directed by Napoleon, to prevent the Austrians from reoccupying the country which had been wrested from their hands. Wrede in his retreat was joined by a body of 3,000 French, but decided, instead of venturing again to face the daring foe, to withdraw to Innsbruck. But withdrawal was not easy. The signal of revolt had everywhere called the Tyrolese to arms. The passes were occupied. The fine old Roman bridge over the Brenner at Ladich was blown up. In the pass of the Brixen, leading to this bridge, the French and Bavarians found themselves assailed in the old Swiss manner, by rocks and logs rolled down upon their heads, while the unerring rifles of the hidden peasants swept the pass. Numbers were slain, but the remainder succeeded in escaping by means of a temporary bridge, which they threw over the stream on the site of the bridge of Ladich. Of the Tyrolese patriots to whom this outbreak was due, 2 are worthy of special mention: Joseph Speckbacher, a wealthy peasant of Rhin, and the more famous Andrew Hofer, the host of the Sand Inn at Passer, a man everywhere known through the mountains, as he traded in wine, corn, and horses as far as the Italian frontier. Hofer was a man of Herculean frame, and of a full, open, handsome countenance, which gained dignity from its long, dark brown beard, which fell in rich curls upon his chest. His picturesque dress, that of the Tyrol, comprised a red waistcoat, crossed by green braces, which were fastened to black knee braces of chamois leather, below which he wore red stockings. A broad black leather girdle clasped his muscular form, while over all was worn a short green coat. On his head he wore a low-crowned, broad-brimmed Tyrolean hat, black in colour, and ornamented with green ribbons and with the feathers of the capercailzie. The striking-looking patriot, at the head of a strong party of peasantry, made an assault, early on the 11th, upon a Bavarian infantry battalion under the command of Colonel Bereklau, who retreated to a table-land named Sterzinger Moos, where, drawn up in a square, he resisted every effort of the Tyrolese to dislodge him. Finally Hofer broke his lines by a stratagem. A wagon loaded with hay, and driven by a girl, was pushed towards the square, the brave girl shouting, as the balls flew around her, "On with ye! Who cares for Bavarian dumplings?" Under its shelter the Tyrolese advanced, broke the square, and killed or made prisoners the whole of the battalion. Speckbacher, the other patriot named, was no less active. No sooner had the signal of revolt appeared in the inn than he set the alarm bells ringing in every church tower through the lower valley of that stream, and quickly was at the head of a band of stalwart Tyrolese. On the night of the 11th he advanced on the city of Halle, and lighted about 100 watch-fires on one side of the city, as if about to attack it from that quarter. While the attention of the garrison was directed towards these fires, he crept through the darkness to the gate on the opposite side, and demanded entrance as a common traveller. The gate was opened, his hidden companions rushed forward and seized it. In a brief time the city, with its Bavarian garrison, was his. On the 12th he appeared before Innsbruck, and made a fierce assault upon the city, in which he was aided by a murderous fire poured upon the Bavarians by the citizens from the windows and towers. The people of the upper valley of the Inn flocked to the aid of their fellows, and the place, with its garrison, was soon taken, despite their obstinate defence. Dittfurt, the Bavarian leader, who scornfully refused to yield to the peasant dogs, as he considered them, fought with tiger-like ferocity, and fell at length pierced by 4 bullets. One further act completed the freeing of the Tyrol from Bavarian domination. The troops under Colonel Wrede had, as we have related, crossed the Brenner on a temporary bridge, and escaped the perils of the pass. Greater perils awaited them. Their road lay past Sterzing, the scene of Hofer's victory. Every trace of the conflict had been obliterated, and Wrede vainly sought to discover what had become of Bereklau and his battalion. He entered the narrow pass through which the road ran at that place, and speedily found his ranks decimated by the rifles of Hofer's concealed men. After considerable loss, the column broke through and continued its march to Innsbruck, where it was immediately surrounded by a triumphant host of Tyrolese. The struggle was short, sharp, and decisive. In a few minutes several hundred men had fallen. In order to escape complete destruction, the rest laid down their arms. The captors entered Innsbruck in triumph, preceded by the military band of the enemy, which they compelled to play, and guarding their prisoners, who included 2 generals, more than 100 other officers, and about 2,000 men. In 2 days the Tyrol had been freed from its Bavarian oppressors and their French allies, and restored to its Austrian lords. The arms of Bavaria were everywhere cast to the ground, and the officials removed. But the prisoners were treated with great humanity, except in the single instance of a tax-gatherer, who had boasted that he would grind down the Tyrolese until they should gladly eat hay. In revenge, they forced him to swallow a bushel of hay for his dinner. The freedom thus gained by the Tyrolese was not likely to be permanent with Napoleon for their foe. The Austrians hastened to the defence of the country which had been so bravely won for their emperor. On the other side came the French and Bavarians as enemies and oppressors. Lefebvre, the leader of the invaders, was a rough and brutal soldier, who encouraged his men to commit every outrage upon the mountaineers. For some 2 or 3 months the conflict went on, with varying fortunes, depending upon the conditions of the war between France and Austria. At first the French were triumphant, and the Austrians withdrew from the Tyrol. Then came Napoleon's defeat at Aspern, and the Tyrolese rose and again drove the invaders from their country. In July occurred Napoleon's great victory at Wagram, and the hopes of the Tyrol once more sank. All the Austrians were withdrawn, and Lefebvre again advanced at the head of 30,000 or 40,000 French, Bavarians, and Saxons. The courage of the peasantry vanished before this threatening invasion. Hofer alone remained resolute, saying to the Austrian governor on his departure, Well, then, I will undertake the government, and as long as God wills, name myself Andrew Hofer, host of the Sand at Passeer, and Count of the Tyrol." He needed resolution, for his fellow chiefs deserted the cause of their country on all sides. On his way to his home he met Speckbacher hurrying from the country in a carriage with some Austrian officers. "Wilt thou also desert thy country?" said Hofer to him in tones of sad reproach. Another leader, Joachim Haspinger, a Capuchin monk, nicknamed Redbeard, a man of much military talent, withdrew to his monastery at Siegen. Hofer was left alone of the Tyrolese leaders. While the French advanced without opposition, he took refuge in a cavern amid the steep rocks that overhung his native vale, where he implored heaven for aid. The aid came. Lefebvre, in his brutal fashion, plundered and burnt as he advanced, and published a proscription list instead of the amnesty promised. The natural result followed. Hofer persuaded the bold Capuchin to leave his monastery, and he, with 2 others, called the Western Tyrol to arms. Hofer raised the Eastern Tyrol. They soon gained a powerful associate in Speckbacher, who, conscience-stricken by Hofer's reproach, had left the Austrians and hastened back to his country. The invaders' cruelty had produced its natural result. The Tyrol was once more in full revolt. With a bunch of rosemary, the gift of their chosen maidens, in their green hats, the young men grasped their trusty rifles and hurried to the places of rendezvous. The older men wore peacock plumes, the Habsburg symbol. With haste they prepared for the war. Cannon which did good service were made from board logs of larch wood bound with iron rings. Here the patriots built abatis. There they gathered heaps of stone on the edges of precipices which rose above the narrow vales and passes. The timber slides in the mountains were changed in their course, so that trees from the heights might be shot down upon the important passes and bridges. All that could be done to give the invaders a warm welcome was prepared, and the bold peasants waited eagerly for the coming conflict. From 4 quarters the invasion came, Lefebvre's army being divided so as to attack the Tyrolese from every side, and meet in the heart of the country. They were destined to a disastrous repulse. The Saxons, led by Rouyer, marched through the narrow valley of Aisach, the heights above which were occupied by Haspinger the Capuchin and his men. Down upon them came rocks and trees from the heights. Rouyer was hurt, and many of his men were slain around him. He withdrew in haste, leaving 1 regiment to retain its position in the Oberau. This the Tyrolese did not propose to permit. They attacked the regiment on the next day in the narrow valley with overpowering numbers. Though faint with hunger in the intense heat, and exhausted by the fierceness of the assault, a part of the troops cut their way through with great loss and escaped. The rest were made prisoners. The story is told that during their retreat, and when ready to drop with fatigue, the soldiers found a cask of wine. Its head was knocked in by a drummer, who, as he stooped to drink, was pierced by a bullet, and his blood mingled with the wine. Despite this, the famishing soldiery greedily swallowed the contents of the cask. A second corps d'armée advanced up the valley of the Inn as far as the bridges of Pruz. Here it was repulsed by the Tyrolese, and retreated under cover of the darkness during the night of August 8th. The infantry crept noiselessly over the bridge of Pontlatz. The cavalry followed with equal caution, but with less success. The sound of a horse's hoof aroused the watchful Tyrolese. Instantly rocks and trees were hurled upon the bridge, men and horses being crushed beneath them, and the passage blocked. All the troops which had not crossed were taken prisoners. The remainder were sharply pursued, and only a handful of them escaped. The other divisions of the invading army met with a similar fate. Lefebvre himself, who reproached the Saxons for their defeat, was not able to advance as far as they, and was quickly driven from the mountains with greatly thinned ranks. He was forced to disguise himself as a common soldier, and hide among the cavalry, to escape the balls of the sharpshooters, who owed him no love. The rear guard was attacked with clubs by the Capuchin and his men, and driven out with heavy loss. During the night that followed, all the mountains around the beautiful valley of Innsbruck were lit up with watch-fires. In the valley below, those of the invaders were kept brightly burning, while the troops silently withdrew. On the next day the Tyrol held no foes. The invasion had failed. Hofer placed himself at the head of government at Innsbruck, where he lived in his old simple mode of life, proclaimed some excellent laws, and convoked a national assembly. The Emperor of Austria sent him a golden chain and 3,000 ducats. He received them with no show of pride, and returned the following naive answer: "Sirs, I thank you. I have no news for you to-day. I have, it is true, 3 couriers on the road, the Vacher Gisele, the Sixten Sibylle, and the Memelefrance, and the Schwanz ought long to have been here. I expect the rascal every hour." Meanwhile Spechbacher and the Capuchin kept up hostilities successfully on the eastern frontier. Haspenger wished to invade the country of their foes, but was restrained by his more prudent associate. Spechbacher is described as an open-hearted, fine-spirited fellow, with the strength of a giant, and the best marksman in the country. So keen was his vision that he could distinguish the bells on the necks of the cattle at the distance of half a mile. His son, Andele, but 10 years of age, was of a spirit equal to his own. In one of the earlier battles of the war he had occupied himself during the fight in collecting the enemy's balls in his hat, and so obstinately refused to quit the field that his father had him carried by force to a distant Alp. During the present conflict, Andele unexpectedly appeared and fought by his father's side. He had escaped from his mountain retreat. It proved an unlucky escape. Shortly afterwards the father was surprised by treachery and found himself surrounded with foes, who tore from him his arms, flung him to the ground, and seriously injured him with blows from a club. But in an instant more he sprang furiously to his feet, hurled his assailants to the earth, and escaped across a wall of rock, impassable except to an expert mountaineer. 100 of his men followed him, but his young son was taken captive by his foes. The king, Maximilian Joseph, attracted by the story of his courage and beauty, sent for him and had him well educated. The freedom of the Tyrol was not to last long. The Treaty of Vienna between the Emperors of Austria and France was signed. It did not even mention the Tyrol. It was a tacit understanding that the mountain country was to be restored to Bavaria, and to reduce it to obedience 3 fresh armies crossed its frontiers. They were repulsed in the south, but in the north Hofer, under unwise advice, abandoned the interior passes, and the invaders made their way as far as Innsbruck, whence they summoned him to capitulate. During the night of October 30th, an envoy from Austria appeared in the Tyrolese camp, bearing a letter from the Archduke John, in which he announced the conclusion of peace and commanded the mountaineers to disperse, and not to offer their lives as a useless sacrifice. The Tyrolese regarded him as their lord, and obeyed, though with bitter regret. A dispersion took place, except of the band of Spechbacher, which held its ground against the enemy till the 3rd of November, when he received a letter from Hofer, saying, "I announce to you that Austria has made peace with France, and has forgotten the Tyrol." On receiving this news, he disbanded his followers, and all opposition ceased. The war was soon afoot again, however, in the native vale of Hofer, the people of which, made desperate by the depredations of the Italian bands which had penetrated their country, sprang to arms and resolved to defend themselves to the bitter end. They compelled Hofer to place himself at their head. For a time they were successful, but a traitor guided the enemy to their rear, and defeat followed. Hofer escaped and took refuge among the mountain peaks. Others of the leaders were taken and executed. The most gallant among the peasantry were shot or hanged. There was some further opposition, but the invaders pressed into every valley, and disarmed the people, the bulk of whom obeyed the orders given them, and offered no resistance. The revolt was quelled. Hofer took refuge at first, with his wife and child, in a narrow hollow in the Kellerlager. This he soon left for a hut on the highest Alps. He was implored to leave the country, but he vowed that he would live or die on his native soil. Discovery soon came. A peasant named Raffl learned the location of his hiding-place by seeing the smoke ascend from his distant hut. He foolishly boasted of his knowledge. His story came to the ears of the French. He was arrested and compelled to guide them to the spot. 2,000 French were spread around the mountain. 1,600 ascended it. Hofer was taken. His captors treated him with brutal violence. They tore out his beard, and dragged him pinioned, barefoot, and in his night-dress over ice and snow to the valley. Here he was placed in a carriage and carried to the fortress of Mantua in Italy. Napoleon, on news of the capture being brought to him at Paris, sent orders to shoot him within 24 hours. He died as bravely as he had lived. When placed before the firing party of 12 riflemen, he refused either to kneel or to allow himself to be blindfolded. "I stand before my Creator," he exclaimed in firm tones, "and standing will I restore to him the spirit he gave." He gave the signal to fire, but the men, moved by the scene, missed their aim. The first fire brought him to his knees, the second stretched him on the ground, where a corporal terminated the cruel scene by shooting him through the head. He died February 20th, 1810. At a later date his remains were borne back to his native Alps. A handsome monument of white marble was erected to his memory in the church at Innsbruck, and his family was ennobled. Of the two other principal leaders of the Tyrolese, Haspinger, the Capuchin, escaped to Vienna, which Spechbacher also succeeded in reaching, after a series of perils and escapes which are well worth relating. After the dispersal of his troops, he, like Hofer, sought concealment in the mountains, where the Bavarians sought for him in troops, vowing to cut his skin into bootstraps if they caught him. He attempted to follow the mountain paths to Austria, but at Dux found the roads so blocked with snow that further progress was impossible. Here the Bavarians came upon his track and attacked the house in which he had taken refuge. He escaped by leaping from its roof, but was wounded in doing so. For the 27 days that followed he roamed through the snowy mountain forests, in danger of death both from cold and starvation. Once for 4 days together he did not taste food. At the end of this time he found shelter in a hut at Boulderberg, where by chance he found his wife and children, who had sought the same asylum. His bitterly persistent foes left him not long in safety here. They learned his place of retreat and pursued him, his presence of mind alone saving him from capture. Seeing them approach, he took a sledge upon his shoulders and walked towards and past them as though he were a servant of the house. His next place of refuge was in a cave on the Gemshaken, in which he remained until the opening of spring, when he had the ill fortune to be carried by a snow-slide a mile and a half into the valley. It was impossible to return. He crept from the snow, but found that one of his legs was dislocated. The utmost he could do, and that with agonizing pain, was to drag himself to a neighboring hut. Here were 2 men, who carried him to his own house at Rhyn. Bavarians were quartered in the house, and the only place of refuge open to him was the cowshed, where his faithful servant Doppel dug for him a hole beneath the bed of one of the cows, and daily supplied him with food. His wife had returned to the house, but the danger of discovery was so great that even she was not told of his propinquity. For 7 weeks he remained thus half buried in the cowshed, gradually recovering his strength. At the end of that time he rose, bade adieu to his wife, who now first learned of his presence, and again betook himself to the high paths of the mountains, from which the sun of May had freed the snow. He reached Vienna without further trouble. Here the brave patriot received no thanks for his services. Even a small estate he had purchased with the remains of his property he was forced to relinquish, not being able to complete the purchase. He would have been reduced to beggary but for Hofer's son, who had received a fine estate from the Emperor, and who engaged him as his steward. Thus ended the active career of the ablest leader in the Tyrolean war. End of Chapter 31. Chapter 32 of Historical Tales, Volume 5, German. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Historical Tales, Volume 5, German, by Charles Morris. Chapter 32 The Old Empire and the New. During the Christmas festival of the year 800, the crown of the imperial dignity was placed at Rome on the head of Charles the Great, and the Roman Empire of the West again came into being, so far as a dead thing could be restored to life. For 1,600 years afterwards this title of Emperor was retained in Germany, though the power represented by it became at times a very shadowy affair. The authority and influence of the emperors reached their culmination during the reign of the Hohenstaufens (1138 1254). For a few centuries afterwards the title represented an empire which was but a quarter fact, 3/4 tradition, the emperor being duly elected by the Diet of German princes, but by no means submissively obeyed. The fraction of fact which remained of the old empire perished in the 30 Years' War. After that date the title continued in existence, being held by the Hapsburgs of Austria as an hereditary dignity, but the empire had vanished except as a tradition or superstition. Finally, on the 6th of August, 1806, Francis II, at the absolute dictum of Napoleon, laid down the title of Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire of the German nation, and the long defunct empire was finally buried. The shadow which remained of the empire of Charlemagne had vanished before the rise of a greater and more vital thing, the Empire of France, brought into existence by the genius of Napoleon Bonaparte, the successor of Charles the Great as a mighty conqueror. For a few years it seemed as if the original empire might be restored. The power of Napoleon indeed extended farther than that of his great predecessor, all Europe west of Russia becoming virtually his. Some of the kings were replaced by monarchs of his creation, others were left upon their thrones, but with their power shorn, their dignity being largely one of vassalage to France. Not content with an empire that stretched beyond the limits of that of Charlemagne or of the Roman Empire of the West, Napoleon ambitiously sought to subdue all Europe to his imperial will, and marched into Russia with nearly all the remaining nations of Europe as his forced allies. His career as a conqueror ended in the snows of Muscovy and amid the flames of Moscow. The shattered fragment of the grand army of conquest that came back from that terrible expedition found crushed and dismayed Germany rising into hostile vitality in its rear. Russia pursued its vanquished invader, Prussia rose against him, Austria joined his foes, and at length, in October, 1813, united Germany was marshalled in arms against its mighty enemy before the city of Leipzig, the scene of the great battles of the 30 Years' War, nearly 2 centuries before. Here was fought one of the fiercest and most decisive struggles of that quarter century of conflict. It was a fight for life, a battle to decide the question of who should be lord of Europe. Napoleon had been brought to bay. Despising to the last his foes, he had weakened his army by leaving strong garrisons in the German cities, which he hoped to reoccupy after he had beaten the German armies. On the 16th of October the great contest began. It was fought fiercely throughout the day, with successive waves of victory and defeat, the advantage at the end resting with the Allies through sheer force of numbers. The 17th was a day of rest and negotiation, Napoleon vainly seeking to induce the Emperor of Austria to withdraw from the alliance. While this was going on, large bodies of Swedes, Russians, and Austrians were marching to join the German ranks, and the battle of the 18th was fought between 150,000 French and a hostile army of double that strength, which represented all northern and eastern Europe. The battle was one of frightful slaughter. Its turning point came when the Saxon infantry, which had hitherto fought on the French side, deserted Napoleon's cause in the thick of the fight and went over in a body to the enemy. It was an act of treachery whose fatal effect no effort could overcome. The day ended with victory in the hands of the Allies. The French were driven back close upon the walls of Leipzig, with the serried columns of Germany and Russia closing them in, and bent upon giving no relaxation to their desperate foe. The struggle was at an end. Longer resistance would have been madness. Napoleon ordered a retreat, but the Elster had to be crossed, and only a single bridge remained for the passage of the army and its stores. All night long the French poured across the bridge with what they could take of their wagons and guns. Morning dawned with the rush and hurry of the retreat still in active progress. A strong rear guard held the town, and Napoleon himself made his way across the bridge with difficulty through the crowding masses. Hardly had he crossed when a frightful misfortune occurred. The bridge had been mined to blow it up on the approach of the foe. This duty had been carelessly trusted to a subaltern, who, frightened by seeing some of the enemy on the riverside, set fire hastily to the train. The bridge blew up with a tremendous explosion, leaving a rear guard of 25,000 men in Leipzig cut off from all hope of escape. Some officers plunged on horseback into the stream and swam across. Prince Poniatowski, the gallant Pole, essayed the same, but perished in the attempt. The soldiers of the rear guard were forced to surrender as prisoners of war. In this great conflict, which continued for 4 days, and in which the most of the nations of Europe took part, 80,000 men are said to have been slain. The French lost very heavily in prisoners and guns. Only a hasty retreat to the Rhine saved the remainder of their army from being cut off and captured. On the 20th, Napoleon succeeded in crossing that frontier river of his kingdom with 70,000 men, the remnant of the grand army with which he had sought to hold Prussia after the disastrous end of the invasion of Russia. Germany was at length freed from its mighty foe. The garrisons which had been left in its cities were forced to surrender as prisoners of war. France, in its turn, was invaded, Paris taken, and Napoleon forced to resign the imperial crown and to retire from his empire to the little island of Elba, near the Italian coast. In 1815 he returned, again set Europe in flame with war, and fell once more at Waterloo, to end his career in the far-off island of St. Helena. Thus ended the empire founded by the great conqueror. The next to claim the imperial title was Louis Napoleon, who in 1851 had himself crowned as Napoleon III. But his so-called empire was confined to France, and fell in 1870 on the field of Sedan, himself and his army being taken prisoners. A republic was declared in France, and the second French Empire was at an end. And now the Empire of Germany was restored, after having ceased to exist for 65 years. The remarkable success of William of Prussia gave rise to a widespread feeling in the German states that he should assume the imperial crown, and the old empire be brought again into existence under new conditions, no longer hampered by the tradition of a Roman Empire, but as the title of United Germany. On December 18th, 1870, an address from the North German Parliament was read to King William at Versailles, asking him to accept the imperial crown. He assented, and on January 18th, 1871, an imposing ceremony was held in the splendid Mirror Hall (Galerie des Glaces) of Louis XIV. At the royal palace of Versailles. The day was a wet one, and the king rode from his quarters in the prefecture to the great gates of the chateau, where he alighted and passed through a lane of soldiers, the roar of cannon heralding his approach, and rich strains of music signalling his entrance to the hall. William wore a general's uniform, with the ribbon of the Black Eagle on his breast. Helmet in hand, he advanced slowly to the dais, bowed to the assembled clergymen, and turned to survey the scene. There had been erected an altar covered with scarlet cloth, which bore the device of the Iron Cross. Right and left of it were soldiers bearing the standards of their regiments. Attending on the king were the Crown Prince, and a brilliant array of the princes, dukes, and other rulers of the German states, arranged in semicircular form. Just above his head was a great allegorical painting of the Grand Monarch, with the proud suscription, Le Roi gouverne par lui-même, the motto of the autocrat. The ceremony began with the singing of psalms, a short sermon, and a grand German chorale, in which all present joined. Then William, in a loud but broken voice, read a paper in which he declared the German Empire re-established and the imperial dignity revived, to be invested in him and his descendants for all future time, in accordance with the will of the German people. Count Bismarck followed with a proclamation addressed by the Emperor to the German nation. As he ended, the Grand Duke of Baden, William's son-in-law, stepped out from the line, raised his helmet in the air, and shouted in stentorian tones, "Long live the German Emperor William! Hurrah!" Loud cheers and waving of swords and helmets responded to his stirring appeal. The Crown Prince fell on his knee to kiss the Emperor's hand, and a military band outside the hall struck up the German national anthem, while, as a warlike background to the scene, came the roar of French cannon from Mount Valérien, still besieged by the Germans, their warlike peal the last note of defiance from vanquished France. 10 days afterwards Paris surrendered, and the war was at an end. On the 16th of June the army made a triumphant entrance into Berlin, William riding at its head, to be triumphantly hailed as Emperor by his own people on his own soil. All Germany, with the exception of Austria, was for the first time fully united into an empire, the minor princes having ceased to exist as ruling potentates. End of Chapter 32. End of Historical Tales, Volume 5, German, by Charles Morris.